April 29, 1868. Men in heavy blue coats and Lakota leaders wrapped in wool and buffalo robes faced one another in the raw spring wind at Fort Laramie while a new line was drawn across the northern plains. The post sat on a bend of the North Platte River where cottonwoods were just leafing, a scatter of log and adobe buildings inside low walls, corrals filled with army horses and mules, and wagon ruts running east toward the Missouri and west toward the Powder River country. Smoke from cook fires hugged the parade ground in the chill air, and soldiers watched from doorways as commissioners from the Indian Peace Commission laid out papers on a rough lumber table for the Sioux and Arapaho men who had come to talk of peace after years of killing along the Bozeman Trail. The war named for Red Cloud had closed forts along the road that cut through prime buffalo ground on the way to Montana, and both sides arrived at Fort Laramie with clear memories of burned wagons, ruined ranches, and men left dead in the snow. General William T. Sherman and other officers wanted an agreement that would guarantee safe corridors for railroads and mail lines and take permanent pressure off the Army in the Powder River country. Lakota leaders wanted the withdrawal of soldiers from their hunting routes and written acknowledgement that the Paha Sapa, the Black Hills and the plains that fed the great herds, would remain in Indian hands. Translators moved between the long wooden benches where Oglala, Brule, Miniconjou, Hunk Papa, and Yanktonai leaders sat with pipes and blankets, trying to shrink distances between English legal phrases and Lakota terms that spoke more of seasons, trails, and shared use. The document read aloud over those days at Fort Laramie set out a great Sioux reservation west of the Missouri River in what is now South Dakota that would include the Black Hills, as land promised for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Sioux people. Article 2 fixed the reservation boundary line and declared that no unauthorized white person would be permitted to settle upon, pass over, or reside within it without consent. Other language established agencies along the Missouri where food, tools, clothes, livestock, and instruction in farming and trades would be supplied in exchange for children going to school, men settling into fixed villages, and the bands staying at peace. To the north and west, the treaty also described broad unceded Indian territory north of the North Platte River and east of the summits of the Bighorn Mountains, where Lakota people could continue to hunt so long as buffalo remained in numbers that justified the chase. For many Lakota families, the most important promises in those pages were simple. Soldiers would abandon the forts that blocked the Bozeman Trail and stop marching through key valleys. White travelers would be kept out of the Black Hills unless the Lakota themselves agreed otherwise. The hunting country stretching through present-day Wyoming and Montana would remain open for as long as the buffalo herds could be followed. In council lodges outside the fort palisade, older men spoke of these guarantees in plain terms to younger warriors who had fought at places like the Fetterman Fight and on the Tongue, describing a future in which some people might move near agencies to take government rations, while others kept guiding lodges along the Powder, Tongue, and Yellowstone rivers when the herd shifted. From the federal side, the treaty text also carried purposes not spoken as loudly on the parade ground. By drawing a large but bounded reservation and promising to close old trails, the government reduced the cost of open warfare and opened the way to steer the Lakota toward farming and dependence on agency issue points. The language granting access to northern hunting grounds was described as generous, yet it sat next to clauses that pushed the tribes to withdraw opposition to railroad construction across the broader plains. Officers who had fought through the Civil War looked at the balance sheet of money and men and saw advantage in concentrating the Sioux and Arapaho along the Missouri, where they could be monitored and fed with flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, and tobacco instead of facing them scattered across the Powder River country in many small war camps. In the first years after the Fort Laramie Treaty, this mixed design played out unevenly along the northern plains. Red Cloud's people settled near the newly created Red Cloud Agency along the White River. Spotted Tail's followers gathered at an agency that bore his name farther downstream, and other Lakota bands were grouped at Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, and other agency posts on the Missouri. Agency carpenters and blacksmiths began work on frame houses, sheds, and an agent's office. Government beef contractors trailed long columns of cattle up from Nebraska and Kansas to be slaughtered when issue days arrived. Army officers reported that thousands of Lakota had come in to receive annuities and rations, and that some were experimenting with small fields of corn, potatoes, and hay near the agency boundaries. Yet even as wagons unloaded sacks of flour and crates of coffee at the agencies, large numbers of Lakota and their northern Cheyenne allies chose to remain for most of the year in the unceded country defined in Article 16. They followed old seasonal rounds that led winter camps into sheltered creek bottoms, then fanned out onto the high plains in late spring to look for new grass and moving herds. Teepees standing along the Powder River or on the Rosebud showed familiar family arrangements, with lodges of related bands clustered together, horse herds grazing nearby, and drying racks filled with meat and hides when hunting went well. Men rode armed with the same mix of weapons that had carried them through Red Cloud's war, including bows, lances, and increasingly growing number of repeating rifles obtained through traders. The environment they moved through still looked rich in 1869 and 1870. Broad swales of buffalo grass and blue grama rolled east from the Bighorns. Cottonwood and willow lines marked the main rivers, while pine crests framed the skyline where the Black Hills formed a dark block on the eastern rim of the Powder River Basin. Herds of bison, elk, and antelope still crossed the country in thick bands. Along the Platte and in Kansas and eastern Colorado, however, hide hunters and railroad traffic had already cut deeply into the southern herds. The Union Pacific and Kansas Pacific lines gave commercial hunting outfits direct routes to ship thousands of hides and bones to distant markets, and Army reports noted the sharp decline in game south of the Platte. For traders at posts along the Missouri and for officials in Washington, the shift in game patterns and the slow gathering of more Lakota at agencies was reported as lifting pressure from the old war grounds. Dispatches from officers in the Department of the Platte recorded fewer raids along certain travel routes, and some officers and civilian observers concluded that the combination of treaty boundaries, Army patrols, and annuity distribution had permanently blunted the capacity of the northern tribes to fight another large coordinated war. The agencies became the main news sources for Eastern newspapers, which printed reports of chiefs accepting medals, signing visitor lists, and posing for photographers in mixed dress that combined eagle feather bonnets with dark wool blankets or cloth coats supplied by the Indian Bureau. Inside many Lakota and Northern Cheyenne camps, the picture looked very different. Men who had fought under leaders like Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and others had not forgotten that the northern hunting grounds had been promised as unceded territory, where no white settlers could lawfully enter. They watched the start of a new phase of rail expansion and heard rumors that survey parties and prospectors were eyeing land beyond the Missouri reservations. At agencies, people waited in long lines while clerks, interpreters, and soldiers oversaw the weighing and cutting of beef and the handing out of flour, sugar, and coffee. When shipments arrived late or short, hunger rose quickly, and memories of free hunting on the Powder and Tongue hardened complaints that the new way was less secure than the old. For federal planners, the Great Sioux Reservation and the unceded hunting grounds also had another weight. The Black Hills within the reservation held dense stands of pine and were rumored to contain mineral wealth. Earlier travelers, missionaries, and army officers had written of rich grass in the sheltered valleys, cooler summers, and heavy timber that could feed sawmills. As Northern Plains settlement advanced after the Civil War, businessmen, railroad promoters, and politicians in Dakota Territory and Nebraska began asking when those resources would be open to development. To them, the language promising absolute and undisturbed use to the Sioux looked like a barrier to be revised. By the early 1870s, pressure to test the hills for gold hardened in territorial capitals and in Washington. Newspapers carried accounts of prospectors who claimed to have seen promising rock formations along streams that cut down out of the high country. Army engineers and civilian entrepreneurs pressed for a reconnaissance expedition that would map the interior of the Black Hills in detail, identify sites for future forts or posts, and evaluate timber and mineral possibilities. In the summer of 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer received orders to lead such an expedition from Fort Abraham Lincoln into the reserved hill country. Custer's Black Hills expedition left the Missouri Valley in early July with a force that included more than 1,000 soldiers from the 7th Cavalry and supporting infantry, a wagon train, scouts, a band, civilian guides, geologists, and journalists. The column carried 2 small cannons and several rapid-firing Gatling guns, tools for building roads and bridges, and enough supplies to remain in the field for weeks. It moved slowly into the hills along routes that would allow wagons to climb, cutting new tracks where necessary and camping in meadows where water and grass were plentiful. Lakota families watching from a distance saw long lines of dust and heard bugle calls echo in valleys. That treaty language had said would be free from unauthorized white encroachment. Within weeks of entering the interior, soldiers and civilian specialists found gold-bearing rock along French Creek near present-day Custer, South Dakota. Pan samples and amalgam plates showed color in the sand and gravel bars. Rumors ran through the camp and out along the routes back to the Missouri, carried by couriers and reporters. In August 1874, the Bismarck Tribune printed a large headline, proclaiming gold in the Black Hills and describing the expedition's findings as proof that significant deposits lay within reach for miners willing to risk the treaty line. That single series of articles did more to alter the future of the Great Sioux Reservation than many clauses drafted at Fort Laramie. Once printed word and private letters confirmed that gold had been found, the stream of prospectors began. Despite the treaty's clear prohibitions, small parties of miners slipped out of the Missouri River towns with pack animals and supplies, aiming for routes that would bring them into the southern and western hills along creeks already marked on maps. Army units at posts such as Fort Randall and Fort Lincoln received orders to intercept and turn back trespassers. Patrols did ride into the hills, arrest parties, burn cabins, and escort miners back out to the Missouri, yet the flow kept increasing as each man turned away spread the news that gold lay in the high country. In Lakota camps, the news arrived through both peaceful and violent encounters. Hunters following game along the foothills saw new smoke from miner fires and heard the ring of axes in pine stands that had once been used mainly for tepee poles and lodge fuel. Prospectors cut into stream banks where women had dug wild turnips and collected berries. Some groups made agreements with local bands or passed through quickly to more remote valleys. Others drove stakes without permission and cut timber without regard for earlier use, taking advantage of the fact that the Army was responsible for enforcing a treaty it was already straining to amend. Territorial officials and business leaders stepped up their lobbying for a formal change in the Black Hills Promise as miner numbers grew. They argued that the hills needed a permanent military presence and that formal towns and mining districts would allow the law to keep pace with events on the ground. They pointed to the gold discoveries as resources the nation needed to develop, and insisted that the Sioux could be compensated with money, livestock, and supplies if they agreed to relinquish title. Newspapers in eastern cities repeated these themes and added that the Lakota were wasting valuable land by keeping it for hunting, while the bison herds declined elsewhere. In the summer and fall of 1875, the Grant administration sent a special commission to the Red Cloud and Spotted Tail agencies to seek a negotiated purchase of the Black Hills. The commissioners were authorized to offer $6 million, paid over a series of annual installments in exchange for formal consent that the hills could be opened to mining and settlement. Meetings under large canvas awnings drew together Lakota leaders, interpreters, and commissioners in suits. Chiefs and headmen listened to the proposals, conferred among themselves, and stated in clear terms that the Black Hills were not for sale. Some countered with vastly higher figures and demands for guaranteed long-term support, but core speakers emphasized that no money could replace the sacred center of their land. The failure of these talks hardened positions on both sides. Lakota leaders who had traveled to Washington or met with commissioners at the agencies returned to their people with another example of treaty language being pressed against by shifting federal priorities. They noted that miners kept coming regardless of the discussions, and that Army patrols often did little to interfere with larger groups heading into the hills. In Washington, officials who had once hoped for a quiet purchase now faced rising pressure from territorial interests, and from members of Congress who viewed Indian resistance to selling the Black Hills as obstruction to national development. By late 1875, estimates placed the non-Indian population in the Black Hills region at more than 15,000 people spread across camp clusters that would soon take on names like Custer and Deadwood. Canvas tents and log shacks crowded narrow gulches where wooded hillsides had been cut back for timber and space. Sluice boxes lined creeks and ore wagons rattled along rough tracks built without any regard to treaty lines. Saloon keepers, merchants, and freighters followed the miners, ready to profit from gold dust that passed quickly across bar counters and store tables in exchange for tools, whiskey, and supplies. On November 3, 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant took a step that signaled how far the balance had shifted. He directed federal agents and Army officers to stop removing miners from the Black Hills, and to cease treating their presence as a violation that required constant eviction. The order left the Black Hills legally within the Great Sioux Reservation on paper while practically opening the door to white occupation. For Lakota families who had trusted the Fort Laramie wording that promised absolute and undisturbed use, the effect was a breaking of faith. For officers planning campaigns on the northern plains, it marked the start of a new phase in which coercion and military pressure would be used to force the remaining strong bands onto distant reservations or into a last hard war. November 3, 1875. The same day, President Ulysses Grant ordered that miners would no longer be driven from the Black Hills. Officials in Washington began shaping the next step that would bear down directly on the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne families still living in the unceded hunting country. In offices lit by tall windows and smoky lamps, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and senior clerks studied agency reports that spoke of ration costs, late supply trains, and the refusal of many bands to leave the Powder River and Yellowstone country. The decision to tolerate trespassing miners in the hills came paired with a resolve to bring the people who held those hills under tighter control, by using hunger and military threat instead of further negotiation. At the Missouri River agencies that fall, the change took shape first in small shifts of tone. At Red Cloud Agency, at Spotted Tail Agency, and at Standing Rock, Indian Bureau agents gathered headmen under rough wooden awnings in inside log offices, telling them that Washington would no longer accept long absences of hunting bands in the far country. Interpreters converted stiff official language into Lakota words that carried a clearer meaning. Those who stayed out would soon be treated not as independent hunters but as hostile people defying orders. Rations, annuity goods, and promised livestock would be tied more strictly to obedience and presence near the agency. Families gathered along the agency streams heard that message against a backdrop of frosts that hardened the ground and thinned the last green along the river flats. Women who had accustomed themselves to waiting in long lines for beef and flour watched clerks tighten their bookkeeping and heard muttered warnings that Washington did not intend to keep feeding people who rode away toward the Powder and Tongue whenever they chose. Men who still kept good horses stabled in brush corrals along the creek banks weighed the choice between staying to receive fixed rations or slipping away again toward winter camps in familiar sheltered valleys where buffalo might still be found in numbers. Inside the War Department, General Philip Sheridan and his staff read those same agency reports with a different emphasis. To them, the persistence of big off-reservation camps in the Powder River and Yellowstone country meant that treaty language and agency incentives had not truly ended resistance. Sheridan had studied the winter campaigns of the earlier Plains Wars and believed that the key to breaking Indian military strength lay in striking villages in cold weather, when pony herds were thin and families carried heavy burdens simply to stay warm. With the Black Hills issue now effectively decided in favor of miners, he saw an opportunity to clear the unceded territory by force while officials worked to rewrite boundaries on paper. On December 3, 1875, an order went out from the Indian Bureau that announced a firm deadline. All Sioux who were not already at the agencies were directed to come in and report by the end of January 1876. Those who failed to do so would thereafter be considered hostile and subject to military operations. The order did not travel by telegraph to distant camps because the families it targeted had no wires or stations. Instead, it moved through agency councils, translated for visiting headmen, and carried west in the mouths of messengers and relatives who rode toward winter camps along the Powder, Tongue, and Rosebud. In the sheltered timber along those streams, the message was received with anger and scorn. Many of the bands who chose to winter away from the agencies had spent years pushing white roads out of their hunting grounds. They had fought soldiers along the Bozeman Trail and watched as forts were abandoned under the Fort Laramie Agreement. They understood that the hills had been promised to them without condition, and that miners now cut into those hills with federal protection. To be told that they were now ordered to come in by a fixed date or be branded enemies struck many as a clear sign that earlier promises had been hollow. Leaders such as Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and others who gathered influence among the off-reservation Hunkpapa, Oglala, Minneconjou, Sans Arc, and Northern Cheyenne spoke plainly in winter councils. They argued that going into the agencies under those terms meant accepting the loss of the hills and the surrender of freedom of movement in the northern country. Older men reminded listeners of winters when people had nearly starved at issue posts after shipments ran late, while hunters away from the agencies had filled dried meat racks from buffalo taken on the open plains. Women spoke of how rations never fully replaced what could be taken in a good hunt, and how agency traders used credit and interest to claw value back from the goods that did arrive. By the time the December order named its January deadline, lodges were already pitched in winter sites. Along the Powder and Tongue, teepee rings formed in lines that followed low ridges and creek bends. Cottonwoods that grew thick near water provided firewood and windbreaks. Snow packed in drifts along draws while ridges remained swept and hard, offering routes to move small hunting parties. Inside the lodges, buffalo hides lined the walls, and robes lay thick on bedding to hold in heat. On cold, clear nights, frosted breath hung in the air above sleeping children, while men rose before dawn to check horses tied in the timber against storms and raiders. Those same winter conditions that shaped Indian camp routines guided Sheridan's campaign planning. In January 1876, he laid out a plan for converging spring and early summer movements that would bring three main army columns toward the expected locations of the large northern camps. One column under General George Crook would move north from the Department of the Yotes Plate, starting from Fort Fetterman on the North Platte River. Another under Colonel John Gibbon would push east and south from forts along the Yellowstone. A third under General Alfred Terry would march west from the Missouri Valley with the 7th Cavalry included in its force. Together they would tighten a net around the Powder River and Bighorn country once the ground began to open after winter. Before that larger plan unfolded, Sheridan wanted a sharp winter blow that would unsettle the camps and show that the new hostile designation was more than words. He turned to Crook, who already had a reputation as a hard-driving commander with experience in winter fighting from earlier campaigns in the Southwest. Crook commanded troops in the Department of the Platte and had ready access to cavalry regiments, infantry companies, and frontier posts that could serve as logistical anchors for a winter thrust. Orders summoned units to Fort Fetterman and placed Crook in charge of an expedition against the bands reported along the Upper Powder. Fort Fetterman stood on a high bluff above the North Platte in what is now central Wyoming, a cluster of log and frame buildings surrounded by open, wind-swept country. In February 1876, that post became a hive of activity. Companies from the 2nd and 3rd Cavalry and from the 4th Infantry arrived in small groups, horse herds trailing behind. Civilian packers and teamsters came in to handle mules and wagons. Farriers worked in bitter cold shoeing horses with iron brought up river, while quartermaster men stacked sacks of flour, boxes of hardtack, barrels of bacon and crates of ammunition in storehouses in preparation for the field. The men who would ride with Crook's winter column felt the weight of the season before they ever left the post. Temperatures dropped well below freezing on many nights, and cutting winds drove fine snow across the parade ground and through gaps in poorly chinked log walls. Soldiers slept in barracks that smelled of coal smoke, wet wool, and unwashed bodies. While on duty they pulled watch in greatcoats stiff with frost. Orders specified that each man carry extra clothing, blankets, and rations, yet there were only so many pounds that an army horse could realistically bear over rough country under winter conditions. Choices had to be made between comfort, ammunition, and speed. Crook understood that winter marches strained animals as much as men. He ordered that his cavalry be mounted on the best horses available, culled from across the department, and he pushed his quartermaster officers to arrange for extra stock at depots along the route so that worn animals could be exchanged during the expedition. He made use of scouts familiar with the Powder River country to plan routes along ridges and benches that would hold less snow and provide better footing than low valley bottoms choked with drifts. He also knew that if the command could reach a village in deep winter, the shock to families with heavy tippy poles, children, and old people would be greater than any raid launched in warmer months. On the Indian side, the expectation of winter raids was not new. Men who had fought in earlier wars remembered columns that pushed into snow-covered country seeking to shatter camps. Watchers kept eyes on the main trails and high approaches, looking for distant dust when the ground was bare and for faint smudges of movement against snowfields when storms cleared. Yet the distances involved and the hardships of winter marching meant that many believed army movements would be limited until later in the season. In councils held inside lodges lit by firelight filtering through smoke holes, leaders repeated their resolve not to submit to the agency order and took stock of ammunition and horses in case fighting came sooner than expected. In early March 1876, Crook moved. His Bighorn expedition rode out from Fort Fetterman with several hundred cavalrymen, a smaller number of infantry mounted on mules, civilian packers, and scouts. The column carried enough supplies to operate for weeks in the field, but not enough to linger if weather turned sharply worse. Ahead of them stretched country that had seen earlier fights, including the abandoned sites of the Bozeman Trail forts. The route took them northwest, crossing frozen or ice-edged streams, climbing over ridges swept bare by wind, and descending into draws where snow lay deep and crusted. Men rode wrapped in overcoats, scarves, and wool gloves, faces reddened and raw from exposure. Horses and mules blew steam as they labored up inclines and slipped on hidden ice. At night, the command made camp in whatever shelter could be found, often in sparse timber along creeks. Fires had to be kept small to conserve fuel, and cooks worked over blackened kettles, turning hardtack, bacon, and coffee into meals that could be swallowed quickly before the cold soaked in again. Saddles froze stiff, blankets sometimes froze where they touched the ground, and men woke with ice on their mustaches and eyebrows. As the column advanced toward the upper powder, scouts picked up signs of Indian movement in the form of old camp rings, willow poles, and faint trail marks where pony herds had passed earlier in the winter. In mid-March, reports came in that a substantial village lay ahead, camped along a sheltered bend of the Powder River. The camp was home to people who had chosen to remain in the unceded country rather than go to the agencies under the December directive. For Crook and his officers, this represented a prime target for the winter expedition, offering a chance to smash lodges, capture horses, and show that defiance carried sharp consequences. On the night of March 16th, Crook detached a striking force under Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds to move ahead of the main column and hit the village at dawn. Reynolds took several cavalry companies and scouts, leaving the slower-moving elements behind. The night was bitterly cold, and the men rode in darkness over rough, broken ground, guided by scouts who knew the routes toward the upper powder. Horses stumbled on rocks and ice, and more than one man fell, only to scramble back into the saddle before the column disappeared into the dark. As gray light began to touch the eastern horizon on March 17, 1876, Reynolds's men closed on the village. From the last ridge before the river, they could see smoke rising from lodge poles and hear faint sounds of camp life muffled by snow and distance. The village lay along a bend in the river where willows and cottonwoods gave some protection from the wind. Teepees stood in clustered rows with pony herds picketed nearby among the trees. Families inside the lodges had no warning that cavalry was so close because Reynolds had approached from high ground, and cold had dampened sound through the night. When the order came, soldiers advanced down toward the river, some dismounting to fire from cover, others leading horses. The attack struck the camp as people were beginning their morning routines. Men rushed to grab weapons, women and children scrambled out of lodges, and loose horses bolted in confusion. Firing broke out along the village edge as warriors tried to form a defense line to cover the flight of families to higher ground. Snow and smoke swirled together, the sharp cracks of carbines answering the deeper booms of rifles inside the lodges and behind downed logs. Reynolds pushed his men through the camp, driving defenders back from lodge to lodge. Soldiers set fire to teepees as they passed, using torches and burning embers to ignite poles and hides now dried by constant use. Flames climbed into the cold air and black smoke rolled along the river bend. Village stores of dried meat, robes, and household goods burned with the lodges, and powder and ammunition stashed inside some shelters exploded in sharp bursts. Warriors and their families fled toward bluffs and draws beyond the river, turning now and then to fire back at the attackers. In the chaos of the fight, Reynolds's command captured a large number of horses from the village. These animals represented a core measure of wealth and fighting capacity for the bands that lived there, and their loss cut deep. Soldiers drove the herd away from the river, pushing them up onto higher ground where other units could hold them. At the same time, some of Reynolds's worn and chilled men began to lose order as they moved through the burning camp. Fires scattered property, and the intermittent sharp return fire from the retreating warriors created confusion that made communication difficult. Despite the initial success in taking and destroying the camp, Reynolds soon faced problems that the hard winter conditions magnified. As the day passed, Indian fighters regrouped on surrounding heights and began firing down on scattered soldiers. The command had to consider its ammunition supply and the state of its cold, exhausted men and animals. In this pressure, and with the knowledge that the main body under Crook was still some distance away, Reynolds made decisions about withdrawing that would later draw harsh criticism. He pulled his men back from the village and began to move the captured horse herd away, leaving some of his own dead on the field and not fully destroying all of the enemy property. During the withdrawal, the combination of deep snow, rugged ground, and aggressive pressure from rallied warriors caused further problems. Some of the captured horses were lost as Indian fighters swooped down in sudden charges to cut animals out of the herd and drive them back toward their own lines. The men guarding the herd struggled to maintain control while also protecting themselves from close-range attacks. The cold that had favored the surprise attack now bit into fingers trying to load weapons and into lungs drawing hard breaths on steep slopes. When Reynolds's battered detachment finally rejoined Crook, the general was far from satisfied. Crook had expected a decisive winter blow that would leave the targeted bands broken and on the run without many of their horses or supplies. Instead, he saw an incomplete victory that had inflicted real damage yet allowed many warriors to escape with enough strength to continue resisting. He ordered a court of inquiry into Reynolds' conduct, focusing on the hasty withdrawal, the failure to secure the field properly, and the loss of some of the captured horses. For the people whose village had been hit on the powder, the memory of that day settled quickly into stories told in lodges and on later trails. They spoke of the sudden shock of soldiers appearing at dawn, the rush to get children and elders away, the burning of carefully prepared winter stores, and the sight of their horse herd driven off through snow by troopers whose own animals strained under the burden. They also spoke of the way men had rallied on the surrounding ridges to fire back and harass the withdrawing columns, proving that even in winter and even under surprise attack, they were still able to fight and survive. Crook's column, for all its outward strength, had paid a price as well. The march back toward Fort Fetterman tested the endurance of every man and animal. Storms swept across the high country, driving fine snow into faces and piling drifts across draws and ravines. Rations ran low, and men chewed on hardtack and thin slices of bacon while keeping a tight grip on their reins with numbed hands. Some soldiers suffered frostbite on fingers and toes, and more than one horse or mule collapsed under the strain and had to be left behind. By March 26, 1876, the expedition reached Fort Fetterman again, trailing a record of burned lodges, lost horses, frozen men, and unanswered questions. On paper, Crook could report a victory in the Powder River fight, marked by the destruction of a significant winter village and the temporary capture of many animals. In reality, he had not crushed the off-reservation movement or forced the northern bands into the agencies before spring. The ultimatum laid down in December had been enforced in part by steel and fire. Yet bands in the unceded country still held together, still remembered the promise of the hills, and still prepared to meet new columns that would surely come when the weather warmed and roads opened along the northern plains. On May 29, 1876, the column that soldiers were already calling the Bighorn and Yellowstone Expedition rode out of Fort Fetterman into a hard, gray morning. The North Platte slid past below the bluffs, running full with spring water, its surface chopped by wind. Men tightened chin straps and glanced back at the low line of buildings that had been their shelter through the last weeks. Bugles called, whips cracked over mule teams, and the long file began to move, cavalry leading, infantry wagons and pack mules stretching out behind in a line that took a long time to clear the flat near the fort. Dust mixed with the chill air as the horses picked up a steady walk toward the northwest. The route out of Fetterman climbed slowly away from the river into open country broken by low ridges and scattered sage. Guides who knew the old Bozeman Trail pointed out faint grooves where wagons had passed years earlier. Paths worn into the soil by freight trains bound for the Montana gold camps before Red Cloud's fighters had shut that road down. Now many of the same ruts carried federal troops in the opposite direction. back into ground that had once cost the army dearly. The thought sat with older officers who remembered the string of losses that had forced the earlier retreat, even if the younger troopers saw only sky, hills, and the backs of the horses ahead. Early in the day, the column settled into a rhythm that would hold for many days. Cavalry rode in blocks of companies with their guidons, small swallowtail flags, stirring above the ranks. Infantry rode in wagons when the terrain allowed or walked beside them when the teams struggled, rifles slung at the shoulder. The heavy supply wagons creaked and jolted, each pulled by 6 mules whose drivers rode the near animals with reins in hand and a whip tucked under one arm. Along the edges of the moving mass rode scouts, some white and some mixed blood, scanning the skyline and the distant valleys for any sign of movement. The country they crossed was both wide and unforgiving. Rolling grassland ran toward blue shapes on the horizon where distant ranges lifted. Closer at hand, the ground broke into shallow coulees and draws cut by snowmelt, requiring constant small shifts in the marching line to avoid traps for wheels and hooves. Sagebrush and prickly pear dotted the higher flats, while buffalo grass and shorter plants formed a pale carpet over much of the ground. The air carried the mixed smells of dust, animal sweat, leather, and the faint sweetness of new growth coming up after winter. Under the horses' iron shoes, the soil was already drying into a light powder that rose in clouds under each step. During halts, men saw signs that they were not the first armed force to come this way. Ruined log walls and overgrown ditches marked the old site of Fort Reno along the Powder River route, now only a memory of the days when the Bozeman Trail had been held by small garrisons. The post had been abandoned under the terms of the Fort Laramie Agreement, and then left to weather and vandals. Crook had no intention of using it as a base. He pushed the column past the ruins, giving them only a brief glance. The sight still had effect. Men knew that an earlier generation of soldiers had tried to hold these lines and had been forced to pull back. They understood that the work now falling to them was meant to reverse that outcome with greater numbers and more drive. As the march carried the column deeper into the old trail country, days grew warmer. Winter's sharp winds gave way to long hours of sun that beat down on hats and shoulders. Overcoats were rolled and tied behind saddles, and men loosened collars that had been pulled tight against snow weeks earlier. The change brought no comfort to animals pulling heavy loads. Under the sun, mules heaved and blew, ears flicking at flies, muscles standing out under their hides. Teamsters shouted and swung whips, driving their rigs up each incline and cursing any beast that balked at a crossing. Water shaped every decision as much as enemy movements. Scouts rode ahead each afternoon to find the best campsites, then returned to guide the wagons toward points where a creek or river offered enough flow for hundreds of animals and men. When the column halted for the night, men spread in squads to water horses and mules, filling canvas buckets and leading animals down to drink in turn. Others gathered fuel. In some places, cottonwood and willow lined the streams, providing wood for cooking fires. In other stretches, there was nothing but dried buffalo chips and scattered brush, and cooks had to coax flame from small piles of collected dung to boil coffee and fry bacon. Arms and equipment bore the marks of constant use. The Springfield carbines and rifles that had been carefully cleaned in Fort Fetterman's company streets were now coated with a film of dust from the trail. Men took time during halts to wipe them down, pushing oiled rags through the barrels and scraping dirt from around the breeches. Cartridge belts rode heavy on hips and shoulders, each loop filled with brass cases waiting their turn in the chamber. Revolvers rested in holsters that picked up sweat and grit, their grips darkened by constant handling. Every man knew that if there was trouble, any weakness in this iron would show quickly. The march tested bodies as much as tools. Soldiers rode or walked for hours each day, feet blistering under worn socks, thighs sore from the unceasing motion of the saddle. Some men developed raw spots where cartridge belts rubbed or where collars chafed. The Army medical staff did what it could, lancing bad blisters, binding sprains, and urging the worst cases into wagons when possible. There was no thought of rest beyond the short halts and nights. The plan demanded that the column cover long distances to reach the northern country before the off-reservation camps could scatter too far. For many, miles the only living things they met in numbers were animals. Antelope stood on distant ridges watching with sharp eyes before flicking their tails and racing away. Prairie dogs chirped near their burrows, then dropped underground as hooves drew near. Some riders saw remnants of the great buffalo herds in the form of scattered animals or small bands, but nothing on the scale that older scouts remembered from earlier years. Men shot what game they could to improve their rationed diet. But each bullet spent was a small subtraction from the boxes that needed to last through whatever engagements lay ahead. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne watchers also saw the column. From hidden vantage points, men observed the moving dust cloud and the glint of sun on metal. They counted cavalry companies by the flags and the size of the horse herds, noted the length of the wagon train, and measured in their minds the weight of this new incursion into a country that had once seen thinner blue lines. Messages passed from one set of observers to another. By the time Crook's command angled toward the drainage of the Tongue River, news of its size and direction had reached larger camps. Leaders there understood that this force, joined later with others, was meant to pin them in place and drive them toward the agencies or into ruin. Around the second week of the march, the land began to change again. Instead of the broad, open basins that lay near the Platte, the route tilted through more broken country with higher ridges and deeper cuts that ran down toward the Tongue. Timber thickened along some of the heights, pine and fir mixing with cottonwood and brush along the steeper slopes. From crest lines, men could see the Tongue's valley, a green strip laid through a harsher frame, carrying clear water north through the plains. Crook's scouts guided the column toward a point near its forks where grass and wood looked sufficient for a substantial camp. On June 9, 1876, that country yielded more than grazing and water. Early that day, Crook ordered a halt near the Tongue so that men and animals could rest and so that scouts could ride out in several directions. The main body came off the line of march and settled into a loose formation near the river. Wagons drawn up, animals turned out under guard to crop the nearby grass. Soldiers loosened saddle cinches, rolled shoulders, and looked forward to a few hours with their boots off. Some knelt to wash in the cold river, splashing water over trail dust and sweat. Others lay back on their bedrolls in the thin shade of wagons, hats over their faces. North of the camp, small parties of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors had been following the column's movement with increasing attention. The combination of terrain near the Tongue and the way Crook's command spread out while resting looked like an opening. A plan took shape among the watchers. They would ride in and test the edges of the camp, looking for weak points, and try to draw cavalry into rough ground where they might ambush isolated elements. It would not be a full-scale battle, but it would send a clear message that the northern country was not empty, and that armed men watched every step the soldiers took. The first sign that something was wrong came when scouts on Crook's flanks reported movement in the distant breaks. Dust puffs and brief glints of light showed where mounted men rode just out of easy range. Crook responded by sending out small detachments of cavalry to push these riders back, refusing to let unknown parties sit unchallenged so close to his resting camp. Saddle cinches were tightened again, carbines checked, and men swung up fast onto horses that only moments earlier had been nosing at the grass with reins trailing. The lazy feel of the midday halt vanished under the old drill habits that came alive whenever trouble threatened. Contact came on broken ground north and east of the main camp, where low ridges and shallow coulees folded together. Cavalrymen moving out in skirmish lines suddenly drew fire from positions that had looked empty. Rifle shots cracked across the draws, bullets kicking up puffs of dirt near hooves and men. Warriors rode in quick, agile bursts, closing distance to shoot and then wheeling away before full volleys from the blue lines could reach them. Some carried repeating rifles that allowed them to send several shots in quick succession without pausing to reload, a clear contrast to the one-shot rhythm of the Springfields. Crook fed more men toward the skirmish, not in a single rush but in controlled movements meant to prevent the kind of scattered pursuit that could be cut apart. Officers shouted orders, waving troopers into broader lines that tried to catch the fast-moving opponents with flanking fire. The air filled with powder smoke that hung in thin veils along the low rises. Horses snorted and danced under the sharp slap of reins and heels. Men firing from the saddle had to keep balance and aim at once, steadying carbines with one hand while the other held their mounts in line. The clash on the tongue that day did not fix into one clear front. Instead, it broke into a series of brief exchanges and shifting flurries of shots across a wide area. At one point, a group of warriors charged close to a section of the line, firing and yelling before breaking off when they saw a larger block of cavalry moving to meet them. Elsewhere, a smaller detachment of soldiers advanced too far into a fold of ground and found themselves fired on from three sides, forcing them to drop from their saddles and use what cover they could until help reached them. In each case, speed and knowledge of the small features of the land gave the native fighters an edge in choosing where to appear and when to withdraw. Despite the sharpness of the fighting, neither side was prepared to commit fully in that place on that day. The warriors had meant to test and sting, not to grind down a force that large in a hastily chosen piece of ground. Crook, for his part, had no intention of driving his men blindly into a chase that could end in disaster among ridges and ravines he had not yet mapped with care. After several hours of scattered engagement with some casualties on both sides, the firing began to slacken. The mounted figures who had ridden so close to the army's resting place pulled back toward the higher ridges, watching to see if the blue lines would follow. By late afternoon, the command stood down from full alert. Pickets remained out, doubled in number and with sharper orders than in the morning. Men led horses back toward water in small groups, still keeping carbines close at hand. Nurses and surgeons moved among the wounded, binding bullet wounds and checking for deeper damage. Dead animals lay where they had fallen until details could be spared to drag them away from the main camp. Even for those who had not traded shots directly, the day carried a cold lesson. The unceded country contained organized, armed resistance that was willing to come close and measure the strength of the Wyoming column before choosing its ground for more serious fighting. Around cook fires that night, talk turned to the way the opponents had moved. Men spoke of riders who seemed to appear from hollows that had looked empty a moment earlier, of quick bursts of fire from weapons that did not need to be reloaded as often, and of painted ponies that handled the broken ground better than many of the army mounts. Others mentioned the steadiness of their own lines under surprise, the speed with which the companies had saddled up, and the way officers had held men back from reckless pursuit. Pride and unease mixed in those conversations, forming a sober understanding that the column would face more such tests as it pushed farther north. Crook's own judgment of the day's action was similar in tone. The skirmish along the tongue had not wrecked his command, but it had underlined the risk of letting the men relax without strong screens in land that belonged in practice to the bands he meant to force into the agencies. He tightened his use of scouts, extending their range and demanding more detailed reports on every fold of ground ahead. He also began to look with greater interest at the idea of bringing in traditional enemies of the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne as allies and guides, men whose own reasons for fighting could be tied to the Army's goals for a season. In the days immediately following the tongue contact, the column moved away from that river and angled toward the smaller stream known as Goose Creek, which flowed north toward the tongue from the eastern slopes of the Bighorn Mountains. The route led through more uneven terrain with higher hills and more frequent stands of timber. Each night, when the wagons formed up and the animals were brought in, men checked their weapons with a more careful hand, remembering how quickly quiet ground could erupt. The first clash with the shadowing bands had come and gone. The larger struggle that would decide whether the northern plains remained open to free hunting or bent fully to federal lines still lay ahead, waiting in the tangled ridges and basins beyond Goose Creek. March 27, 1876. The yard at Fort Fetterman still showed the lines cut into the dirt by exhausted hooves and wagon wheels from the command that had just come back from the frozen march to the Powder River. Men wrapped in army greatcoats moved stiffly between barracks and stables, some with bandaged hands and faces, others walking on sore feet inside boots that had rubbed skin raw during weeks of marching. Horseflesh hung loose on ribs in the corrals, and more than a few animals stood with heads down, tails twitching weakly in the cold wind that blew along the bluffs above the North Platte. Inside the post headquarters, Brigadier General George Crook stared at a map spread across a rough wooden table and worked through the fact that the winter blow he had just delivered had not broken the northern resistance. The report on the Bighorn expedition lay finished near his arm, pages filled with steady handwriting that described the mile counts, temperatures, frostbite cases, and the burning of the village on the upper Powder. He had recorded that hundreds of lodges had been destroyed and that livestock and stores had been taken and lost again, that his men had suffered from cold and hunger, and that the enemy bands had slipped away to fight another day. The numbers told a plain story. The campaign had cost months of effort and left the non-reservation Lakota and Northern Cheyenne still in possession of the broad hunting country that Washington wanted under control. As Crook's clerk sanded the ink and folded the pages for forwarding, telegraph messages from Omaha and Chicago were already closing in with the outline of the next campaign. General Philip Sheridan's orders made it clear that the push against the off-reservation bands would not pause because of one inconclusive winter fight. The coming season would see 3 main army columns move into the unceded country, with Crook's force advancing from the south out of Wyoming Territory, John Gibbon's troops approaching from the west along the Yellowstone, and Alfred Terry's command pushing in from the east with the 7th Cavalry. Their combined purpose was to strike the large, free-roaming villages, force families onto the reservation agencies, and remove any doubt that the Black Hills and Powder River country would be kept open for mining and transport. Crook read and reread his own instructions, knowing that his column had already seen how hard the country could take punishment and still shelter people who knew every draw and ridge. At Fort Fetterman, the new campaign meant that the post changed almost overnight from a cold, weary way station into a staging ground for one of the largest field forces ever assembled in that part of the plains. Messengers carried written orders to scattered companies of the 2nd and 3rd Cavalry and the 4th and 9th Infantry, summoning them to concentrate at the fort. Quartermaster officers sent requisitions back along the routes to supply depots and railheads in Nebraska Territory for more ammunition, food, forage, and clothing. Civilian contractors, teamsters, and packers began arriving in 2s and 3s, drawn by notices that the Army would need experienced hands for a long campaign through rough country. Within days, additional troops started to come in. Blue columns appeared on the horizon to the south and east, small dust clouds marking their approach long before the sound of bugles and jingling tack reached the post. Companies of the 2nd Cavalry rode through the gate and up onto the parade ground, men sitting their horses under guidons that snapped in the ever-present wind. The 3rd Cavalry added more companies, men who had heard only fragments of the winter stories now checking the faces of those who had survived frostbite and the bitter march to the upper Powder. Infantry companies from the 4th and 9th arrived by wagon and on foot, dusty and stiff from long rides across the high country, their rifles stacked in pyramids outside temporary tents and huts. As the companies assembled, Crook and his staff worked to turn this mixture of units into a single effective column. The plan called for 15 companies of cavalry and 5 companies of infantry, more than 900 officers and enlisted men in regular army ranks alone, with a large train of civilian teamsters, packers, hunters, and interpreters to follow. The soldiers would go into the field with hundreds of horses and mules, 106 wagons loaded with supplies, and 250 pack mules ready to shoulder burdens where wheels could not roll. Headquarters placed the 2nd and 3rd Cavalry at the core of the mounted arm, with the infantry companies assigned to guard trains, hold key ground in a fight, and, when needed later, ride muleback to keep pace with the faster elements. Inside the post workshops, farriers and blacksmiths swung hammers from morning until deep into the night. Sparks flew from anvils as they shaped new shoes and repaired old ones, fitting iron carefully to hooves so that horses could carry men over the broken country north of the Platte without going lame too soon. Leather workers patched saddles and harness, cutting straps from hides and stitching them onto worn gear to keep it serviceable for at least one more season. Wagon-wrights crawled under beds and between wheels, tightening bolts and replacing cracked spokes. The air in those sheds smelled of coal smoke, singed hair, grease, and worked leather. In the company streets, officers walked down ranks inspecting weapons. The standard long arm in most hands was the Springfield carbine or rifle, a single-shot breech-loader chambered for the new government center fire cartridges. Men practiced snapping open the breech block, feeding in rounds from the cartridge box at the waist, closing the action and firing, building speed until their movements became habitual. Sidearms consisted mainly of Colt revolvers, 6-shot weapons that gave cavalrymen a way to fight at very close quarters if they were pressed hard. Some old Spencer and Sharps pieces still appeared among scouts and civilians, but the regular line relied on the Springfields. Crook believed that steady, accurate fire from disciplined lines and well-handled skirmishers could answer the faster shooting repeaters that many Lakota and Cheyenne now carried. The winter campaign had shown what happened when men lacked proper cold weather gear and when rations ran short in deep snow. With spring moving in, different dangers rose. Quartermasters worried over grain and water for animals as much as food for men. The country ahead held stretches where streams ran low late in the year, but in April and May, snowmelt could turn crossings into cold, dangerous fords. To prepare, Crook ordered extra sacks of oats, additional cans of coffee and sugar, and more medical supplies than had gone out with the winter expedition. Surgeons filled panniers with bandages, laudanum, surgical tools, and quinine. Commissary clerks checked off boxes of hardtack, bacon, beans, and dried fruit as they arrived, marking tallies on slates and in ledger books. Life for enlisted men during those late March and April days settled into a hard, repetitive rhythm. Reveille pulled them from bunks before dawn. They formed up in the chill half-light for roll call, then broke ranks to hurry through breakfast in the mess, eating fried bacon, potatoes if available, and biscuits washed down with black coffee. Morning drills followed, with cavalrymen mounting up for formations, wheeling and changing direction at shouted commands and practicing dismounting, forming skirmish lines and remounting under imagined fire. Infantrymen marched across the parade ground and out onto the open flats, learning to deploy quickly from column into lines that could cover more ground, and then to contract again to fit rough terrain. After drill came equipment work. Men sat on benches and overturned boxes, cleaning their carbines and revolvers, applying oil sparingly to moving parts, then wiping bores until patches came out mostly clean. Saddles were taken apart for inspection, blankets shaken out and dried in the weak sun, and cartridge boxes checked to ensure that leather seams had not split. Some men visited the post sutler to buy extra tobacco, canned goods, or simple luxuries such as dried apples and candy using pay that often ran thin once debts were settled. Others used spare moments to scratch letters home on lined paper describing the cold, the rumors of a new march, and the constant sense that their general intended to go back into the same country that had just punished them so fiercely. Crook himself kept to a spare, disciplined routine that set the tone for the command. He rose early, ate quickly, and then spent long hours in his headquarters office surrounded by maps and reports. Thin sheets showed the Platte, Powder, Tongue, and Rosebud rivers, traced across wide spaces of unknown broken ground. Pins and notes marked places where scouts, agency reports, and earlier campaigns had located Indian camps. Crook questioned scouts like Frank Gruard, who had ridden deep into the country during the winter expedition, and knew the routes that non-reservation bands took as they shifted their camps with the season. He listened closely to their accounts of trails, water, and grass, and incorporated this knowledge into his plans rather than relying solely on older Army maps compiled from limited surveys. Messages from higher headquarters made it clear that the timetable for the summer column was tight. Sheridan wanted Crook moving as soon as the grass grew enough to support grazing for thousands of animals, and as soon as wagon wheels could roll without bogging down in snow and mud. Yet if Crook moved too early, he risked repeating the hardship of the winter march and wearing out horses and men before serious fighting began. The weeks after the return from the Powder therefore became a race against the season. Each day brought slightly warmer temperatures, more thawed ground, and a little more green along the river bottom, while at the same time the non-reservation villages far to the north broke up their winter lodges and began to spread across the plains in search of fresh forage. Across the unceded country, Lakota and Northern Cheyenne families used the same spring days to rebuild their strength. On sheltered tributaries of the Tongue and Rosebud, men and women took down hide liners used to insulate lodges through the deepest cold and prepared to move their camps toward better grazing. Children helped drive pony herds to new patches of buffalo grass. Hunters rode out over ridges made bare by wind, scanning for bison herds that had drifted north. In councils held without white observers, leaders weighed reports that Crook had struck one winter camp and then gone back to Fort Fetterman. Many expected that he would return once the grass came, this time with a larger force and backed by other columns pushing in from different directions. The Army's advantage in prepared logistics and centrally directed planning rested against the native advantage in intimate knowledge of the land and ability to move whole communities quickly when threatened. Crook's men could carry Springfield carbines, pistols, and boxes of ammunition manufactured in distant factories, and they could draw on depots and wagon trains that followed the railroad as far as the Platte. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors carried a mix of repeaters, older muzzle-loading trade guns, and traditional bows, and they moved with their families in lodges that could be struck and loaded onto travois and pack animals in short order. The winter fighting had already shown that burning one village did not end resistance. Entire bands could regroup downriver or across a range, guided by men who had grown up reading the folds of the land. By late April, signs of the coming march were impossible to miss for anyone at Fort Fetterman. Great stacks of hay and grain rose near the stables. Extra horses and mules were held in separate corrals, branded and counted. Wagon trains from Cheyenne and other supply points rolled into view in long columns. Canvas covers stained with dust and weather. Teamsters snapping whips over 6 mule teams to drag heavy loads up from the river flats. Empty wagons turned around and rattled south again for another run. The post buzzed with hammering, shouting, and the clank of chains as harness was fitted and tested. Bugle calls cut across this noise, imposing a military rhythm on what sometimes resembled a crowded frontier freight yard. The men who had survived the winter expedition watched all this with a clear understanding that the next move would carry them even farther into hostile country. They knew now that the Powder River Basin and the lands beyond were not empty stretches on maps, but a tangle of ravines, frozen creeks, sudden ridges, and distances that wore down even strong animals. They had seen how quickly a dawn attack could plunge a camp into confusion, and how hard it was to keep captured stock under control under pressure. Around the barracks stove at night, they spoke quietly of frozen marches, the smoke of burning lodges, and the sight of warriors riding close in bright painted gear, firing from bareback horses before wheeling away. Those experiences settled into a hard core of caution underneath outward discipline. New men who had not gone north in March listened to those stories and tried to imagine what lay ahead. Some joked loudly in an attempt to cover nerves, boasting of how the column would sweep the plains clear. Others grew silent, counting cartridges and checking straps again and again. The difference in tone between veterans of the winter march and fresh arrivals created small tensions in the barracks. But shared work and the constant press of preparations kept open arguments rare. When the bugle sounded for lights out, both groups lay down, knowing that the coming expedition would test every man in ways that drill on the parade ground never could. During May, the weather shifted fully into spring. The North Platte ran higher, carrying broken pieces of ice and whole logs downstream, its surface flashing under the sun. Grass came up thicker along the bottomlands, giving horses and mules something more than old hay and grain to chew. Thunderheads began to build on some afternoons, throwing sheets of rain across the open country and turning wagon ruts into slick channels that dried into hard ridges when the sun returned. These changes told Crook that the window for movement was opening. Grass for grazing would support the column's animals, and the roads toward the north, though rough, would no longer be buried in deep snow. On May 28, 1876, Crook took direct field command of the assembled Bighorn and Yellowstone expedition at Fort Fetterman. Final inspections ran through the day. Officers checked company rolls against the men present, making sure that each roster matched the flesh standing in ranks under the sun. Quartermasters verified that each wagon carried its assigned load of rations, ammunition, spare clothing, and tools. Surgeons ensured that medical panniers were complete and organized for quick use. Scouts reported in for duty, including Frank Gruard and other experienced plainsmen who would ride ahead of the column to find water, grass, and any signs of enemy movement. That evening, as the light faded along the North Platte, the post settled into a strained quiet. Animals were watered and fed for the last time inside the fort's immediate reach. Men rolled in their blankets, knowing that when the bugles blew on the following day, they would be riding out not on a short patrol or a punitive raid, but on a long campaign designed to push deep into the northern plains. The winter fight on the Powder had been a hard introduction. The column now forming at Fort Fetterman was larger, better supplied, and more tightly organized. It would leave the post as the Wyoming column, carrying the weight of Sheridan's plan and the expectation that it would find and strike the northern villages that had refused to bow to deadlines set in distant offices. June 14, 1876. Crook's camp at Goose Creek lay along a narrow valley under the eastern face of the Bighorn Mountains, while the Wyoming column paused after the hard push from the tongue. Tents and wagon lines stood close to the stream. Horses and mules cropped the new grass along the banks. Cook fires sent up thin smoke that mixed with the smell of leather and gun oil. For the first time in weeks, many men rested near their stacked rifles, aware that the next move would carry them deeper into a country where no post or town stood behind them. Soon after sunrise, lookouts on the southern hills pointed to a dust column rising along the horizon. It grew as it came closer, showing the steady movement of organized riders. Crook ordered his command into formation on the trampled ground used for drill. Cavalry companies formed neat ranks with guidons lifting and falling. Infantry bodies gathered near the wagons. When the approaching figures rode down off the higher country into the valley, men in line saw Crow and Shoshoni allies advancing in a compact mass, their horses stepping evenly as if on parade. The allied scouts stood out at once. Many Crow warriors wore feathered headgear or wrapped braids, bright blankets, and shirts marked with beadwork. Faces carried fresh paint in hard lines. Across their laps lay repeating rifles with cartridge belts crossed over their chests. The Shoshoni behind them showed a similar mix of traditional dress and modern firearms. Their smaller horses moved with quick, sure steps that told of long work on rough ground. Crook waited near the center of his drawn-up line, campaign coat buttoned and hat pulled low, senior officers at his side. He had chosen a full military reception, confident that the sight of nearly 1,000 regulars in order would underline the reach of the summer campaign. A bugle call sounded as the Crow and Shoshoni approached. Carbines came across saddles in one motion. On signal, the Allied riders halted in front of the troops. The valley filled with the sound of horses blowing and equipment rattling. Chiefs and officers stepped forward into the open space between the two formations. Plenty Coups came with other leading Crow men, including Old Crow and Medicine Crow. Washakie rode to the front for the Shoshoni. Interpreter Frank Gruard placed himself where he could hear each man clearly. Hands were shaken in turn. Some Crow and Shoshoni gave short greetings in English learned at agencies or from traders. Others spoke only through the interpreter while looking along the ranks of blue coats and the long line of animals behind them. Crook stated the purpose of the column in direct language. The army had come to bring non-agency bands under control and to end the use of the unceded country as a secure base. Gruard rendered the words. Old Crow and other headmen answered at length. They described years of Lakota and Cheyenne attacks against Crow camps and horse herds and said they had waited for a chance to strike back with support strong enough to matter. One Crow speaker said that Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors now gathered in the north in numbers that matched the grass on the hills. Officers standing nearby remembered that phrase. Washakie spoke for the Shoshoni in similar terms, describing pressure on his people from Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho movements. His men, he said, had not come to stand in the rear. They expected to ride in front and to fight where danger would be sharpest. Crook approved in open words. His own record rested on using tribal enemies as guides and advance screens. With strong Crow and Shoshoni contingents present, he now had riders who knew the folds of the land and the trails to the great northern villages better than any white scout. Later that day, the mixed camp showed how quickly these groups began to test one another. Crow and Shoshoni riders inspected army mounts and gear. Soldiers examined lighter native saddles and rawhide ropes. Informal shooting trials began. Crow men worked the levers of their repeaters and fired strings of shots at distant marks, while troopers answered with slower volleys from their single-shot Springfields. Each side measured the other's equipment and habits with a professional eye. After dark, a large fire burned near the Allied lodges. Around it, Crook convened a council that drew principal officers, leading Crow and Shoshoni chiefs and the interpreters. Men sat or stood in a wide ring, meat roasted on sticks, coffee boiled in iron pots. Outside the circle, younger warriors and enlisted men watched from the edge of the light. Here the talk settled into precise matters. Crow scouts explained what they knew of the enemy position. They set out that a very large village of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho stood on a creek west of the Rosebud, a gathering of many bands under one loose camp circle. With sticks in the dust, they marked the lines of lodges and the stretches where horses grazed. They told Crook that every lodge held one or more men who could mount and ride quickly. Their judgment, based on direct observation and reports from friendly informants, was that this was a central village, not a stray hunting camp. Officers pressed them for details on trails, crossings, slopes, and water. While these plans took shape at Goose Creek, another set of councils filled lodges along Ash Creek where the northern village stood. Hundreds of teepees lined the bends of the water, grouped by band but tied by marriage and shared cause. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho families lived side by side. Horse herds grazed under guard on nearby slopes. Men who had watched the approaches to the camp returned each evening with fresh reports on Crook's march and on the new presence of Crow and Shoshoni riding with his column. Inside one of the main council lodges, Crazy Horse met with other leading Lakota, with Northern Cheyenne men such as Two Moon and Little Hawk, and with Arapaho representatives. Respected elders and spiritual leaders sat among them. Crook's advance, backed by tribal enemies of the village, posed a clear problem. If the army found the camp on Ash Creek, families and herds would be at direct risk. Some elders favored breaking the village into smaller parts or shifting farther away from the line of march until the federal strength thinned. Younger leaders and many seasoned warriors argued against that course. They recalled that the valleys along the Rosebud and the neighboring country had been set aside for their use under written promises, and that these same regions now felt the pressure of multiple army columns. They pointed to the winter campaign and the January demand that all bands report to agencies and said that constant retreat would only invite more attacks. They insisted that it would be better to ride out, find Crook first, and meet his column away from the lodges in ground they knew in detail. No one in the lodge questioned the seriousness of the choice. The decision that emerged from these debates committed the village to open confrontation. The combined camp would remain on Ash Creek under the protection of elders, women, and younger boys. Selected warriors from many Lakota bands, from Northern Cheyenne societies, and from Northern Arapaho groups would ride out in one strong force to strike Crook before he could reach the families. Crazy Horse would direct the movement. Two Moon, White Bull, Little Hawk, and other prominent figures would hold important positions within the overall command. Women would support the march by preparing food, packing ammunition, and readying spare horses. On June 15th, while these preparations advanced on Ash Creek, Crook tightened his own arrangements at Goose Creek. The surface of the camp carried an almost festive air. Crow and Shoshoni scouts ran horse races on the flats and showed how they could drop to one side of a running horse and fire from under its neck. Soldiers watched and judged what these skills would mean in the broken hills of the Rosebud. At the same time, orders moved quietly through the ranks. Crook would leave the heavy wagon train and extra stores at Goose Creek under a mixed guard and push north with the most mobile part of his force. He directed that the marching column consist of the main cavalry and mounted infantry, the allied Crow and Shoshoni, and a limited number of armed civilian volunteers. Each soldier received 4 days of rations to carry and 100 cartridges for his primary weapon. Additional stores went on pack mules. Officers received written instructions on their positions in the order of march and on how to respond if contact came suddenly from any direction. The plan aimed at reaching the Rosebud headwaters quickly, hitting hard, and then either breaking up resistance or driving it toward the other converging federal commands. On June 16th, the field force left Goose Creek. Wagons, extra supplies, and part of the command remained behind under guard. Ahead, Crow and Shoshoni scouts fanned out across the ridges, choosing routes that would bring the soldiers toward the upper Rosebud by the most practical paths. Under a high, clear sky, the long column wound through green hills and shallow drainages, the men now fully aware that they were moving in a region where Lakota and Northern Cheyenne scouts watched from favorable rises. The land around the Rosebud headwaters showed early summer in full strength. Grasses covered the slopes. Stands of cottonwood and willow marked the wetter draws. Herds of buffalo grazed on the lower flats. Midway through the day, a group of Crow and Shoshoni riders rode at one of those herds and began dropping animals with rapid fire from their repeaters. The heavy sound of hoofbeats and the sharp crack of many shots rolled back over the line of march. Men in the main column paused, aware that any watchers on distant hills would also hear. Crook rode forward in anger. The burst of gunfire had destroyed any remaining hope that his advance up the Rosebud would remain unnoticed. He rebuked the men who had taken part in the hunt and ordered stricter control over shooting and ammunition. The same repeating rifles that he relied on for flexible scouting had just announced the mixed column to the northern plains. Officers carried the warning down the line. No one doubted that word of a strong combined force moving through the headwaters had gone out in several directions. That evening, Crook halted near the upper reaches of the Rosebud. Most men unrolled blankets on the ground and slept near their horses, saddles close at hand. Only a few tents rose for headquarters and the medical staff. Pickets stood on the surrounding hills with Allied scouts taking the more distant posts. In the fading light, soldiers cleaned weapons, checked cartridge belts, and spoke in low tones. There were no towns or posts behind them now. Only the guarded wagon park at Goose Creek. The cool night underlined how far they stood inside the contested country. On Ash Creek that same day, the decision to carry the war toward Crook turned from words to action. Messengers passed through the village calling selected warriors to prepare. Rifles, carbines, and older trade guns were checked. Bows were strung and quivers filled. War shirts and leggings marked for past deeds came out of storage. Horses were gathered and groomed, manes combed, tails tied to avoid tangling during hard riding. Women filled parfleche bags with dried meat and fat and packed extra moccasins and clothing. Ceremonies marked the start of the journey. Singers brought out drums and raised war songs that named enemies and called for protection. Medicine men painted symbols on faces and chests and tied small protective bundles in warriors' hair. Mothers, wives, and sisters stood at lodge doors as older sons and husbands mounted. Everyone understood that Crook's column, armed with modern weapons and backed by tribal enemies, posed a danger that could not be ignored. Late that night, the warrior column moved out. Lakota riders from several divisions, Northern Cheyenne fighting men, and Northern Arapaho groups formed a long file along the creek, then crossed the shallow water and climbed the first rise beyond the lodges. Once clear of the village, they turned toward the east and northeast where scouts had last seen Crook's trail. Behind them, the glow of the campfires faded. Ahead, moonlight marked the ridges and the dark troughs of ravines. Through the hours that followed, the mounted force advanced steadily over country many of them knew from hunts and previous war parties. They cut across the grain of the land to avoid deep cuts and stayed near water when they could. At selected places, they halted long enough to rest horses, share meat, and talk quietly on what lay ahead. Men who had already fought soldiers explained how Springfields fired and how army lines moved. Younger warriors listened and measured their own resolve. Near dawn on June 17th, they reached higher ground from which they could look toward the headwaters of the Rosebud where Crook's men now rested. Horses stood sweat-streaked but sound. The decision made in the Ash Creek lodges remained fixed in every mind. The army would not find the northern village unprotected. The warriors had come out to meet the column in the rolling country near the upper Rosebud and to prove that the northern plains still answered to them in battle. As the eastern sky began to lighten, advance scouts searched the folds between the ridges for the first trace of Crow or Shoshoni pickets. The opening move in the fight was only moments away. June 17, 1876, the men of Crook's field command were shaken awake in the dark at 3 o'clock in the morning while frost still clung to the grass along the south fork of the Rosebud. Bugles sounded the thin notes of reveille through the narrow valley. Cook details moved toward the embers of the night's fires, stirring coals and setting coffee pots in place. Muleteers cursed quietly as they tightened harness on teams that had barely cooled from the long march of the day before. Horses stood in long lines, steam rising from their backs, shifting under rough hands that dragged blankets and saddles into place in the dim light. By 6 o'clock, the column was mounted and moving again, following the twisting course of the South Fork downstream. The stream cut a crooked line through country that rose on both sides in broken bluffs and ridges, so that the route was never straight for long. The trail crossed and recrossed the water, sometimes forcing the men to ride through stony shallows, sometimes sending them up onto benches where the soil turned to loose dust under the hooves. The previous day's march had run close to 35 miles, and the strain showed on the mule-mounted infantry and on many of the horses. Men rode with shoulders hunched, faces lined with fatigue, cartridge belts hanging heavy across their chests. Crook rode near the front on a dark horse, watching the shapes of the country as closely as he watched the line of troopers. To his left and right, Crow and Shoshoni scouts skimmed the heights, keeping to the crests where they could look down into the hollows and cuts that the main body could not see from the valley bottom. Some of those Allied riders had been awake through most of the night, slipping beyond the picket line to listen for any sound of enemy movement and to search the ridges for fresh sign. Now they moved in a loose screen, rifles laid across their laps, eyes scanning every fold that might mask an approach. Behind the leading elements stretched the main body of nearly 1,300 men and animals. Companies of the 2nd and 3rd Cavalry rode in their assigned places, guidons lifting and dipping with the motion. Mounted infantry from the 4th and 9th Regiments kept pace, their mules stepping shorter and rougher than the cavalry horses, packs creaking with each jolt. Civilian packers, hunters, and volunteers rode near the rear or alongside the wagons that still accompanied the column this far, watching chains, wheels, and traces for any break that might halt the long line in a bad place. As the light strengthened, the valley opened briefly into a wider basin where low ridges fell back from the stream on both sides. Grass grew thicker on the flats near the water. Willow and cottonwood clustered in irregular bands along the banks. Here Crook saw a chance to pull his men and animals together after the grinding march. Around 8 o'clock, he gave the order to halt and rest. The command stopped in marching order within that natural bowl. The head of the column still stretched forward along the stream bed, the tail just entering the broader ground. Horses were unsaddled and led to graze with bridles removed so that they could crop more easily. Mules stood in small knots with packs loosened. Infantrymen slid to the ground from their mounts and stamped feeling back into their feet. Some men dropped where they stood and lay on their blankets, hats over their faces, trying to steal a short sleep. Others gathered around cook fires to drink coffee, chew hardtack, and fry bacon in blackened pans. Boots came off in places, showing blistered, swollen feet that had spent too many hours jammed in wet leather. For a short time, the energy of the column flowed into simple needs, while officers walked among the scattered groups and checked on the general condition of the units. Crow and Shoshone scouts did not rest. They rode on toward the higher ground north and northeast of the basin, taking positions along the bluffs and ridges that rose beyond sight of the riverbed. From those heights, they could look down into the valley and also northward toward the broader country where the Rosebud and its tributaries cut through the plains. Their horses moved quietly among patches of sage and rock. Men dismounted to study the horizon, some lying on their stomachs with rifles across their arms, watching for dust, movement, or the glint of metal in the far distance. Beyond those same ridges, the warrior column from Ash Creek had closed the last miles of its long ride. The Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho fighters had been in motion since the previous night, following a line that brought them over low divides and into the uplands above the Rosebud South Fork. Horses foam streaked and sweat darkened, They halted only briefly in the dark hours to let animals breathe and to share dried meat before pressing on again. As dawn edged the eastern sky, the leading scouts saw faint smears of dust and smoke ahead where Crook's command moved along the river. When the sun rose fully, the sheer size of the enemy column became clear, stretching along the crooked valley with its head already inside the basin where Crook now rested. Crazy Horse and the other leaders rode the length of their own formation, speaking to groups in turn. They did not intend to let the soldiers reach the northern village unchallenged. The plan fixed in those moments on the high ground was straightforward and hard. A portion of the warriors would swing wide to threaten the front of the army column. Others would press directly against the allied Crow and Shoshoni screen, and still others would move toward the low ground near the river in an attempt to reach the unsaddled horses and the resting men before they could properly form. The numbers behind that intent were significant. Hundreds of mounted fighters stood in loose ranks, each man armed in his own way, with a mixture of Winchester or Henry repeating rifles, older trade guns, pistols, and bows. The first contact came between those two sets of scouts. As the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne advance riders eased closer to the ridges above Crook's camp, Crow and Shoshoni pickets spotted them and signaled with gestures and calls. Shots rang out across the broken ground, single rounds at first, then faster sequences as men on both sides returned fire from behind rocks and scrub. The sound floated down into the basin as a dull, irregular popping, separated by moments of quiet when riders shifted position or closed distance. Up on the heights, Crow and Shoshoni scouts found themselves facing a much larger body of warriors forcing its way forward along the ridge lines. Those allied fighters understood what would happen if they simply gave ground and rode back to Crook without resistance. The enemy could pour down into the basin in a single rush and strike unsaddled horses and men still half asleep. So they chose instead to trade time for blood. Small groups of Crow and Shoshoni dismounted, using the low rise of the bluffs for cover. They fired deliberate shots into the approaching mass, knocking horses down and forcing riders to slow and scatter. When pressure grew too heavy in one spot, they leaped back into the saddle and fell to the next fold in the ground, then repeated the process. Men shouted to one another in Crow, Shoshoni, Lakota, and Cheyenne, the words mixing over the crack of rifles and the pounding of hooves. Down in the basin, the first handful of distant shots drew little concern. Some soldiers laughed that the scouts must have found game again despite Crook's anger over the hunt on the previous day. Others barely lifted their heads from their blankets. Then the rate of fire thickened in a way that no one mistook. Shots began to cluster into short volleys, overlapping in a steady, harsh rhythm. Officers looked toward the bluffs north of camp and saw faint puffs of smoke hanging along the skyline. Men paused with cups in hand. A few reached automatically for carbines resting on saddles or stacked in nearby piles. The warning came in the form of two Crow scouts who broke from the fight on the heights and rode directly into the basin at a dead run. Their ponies pounded across the flat ground, nostrils flaring, sweat and dust caked along their sides. As they reached the edge of the resting column, both men shouted the same word, naming the Lakota in tones that carried the full weight of what they had just seen. There was no longer any doubt that the enemy had arrived in strength and that the scattered camp sat in the path of a serious blow. Orders cut through the confusion. Drummers and buglers sounded assembly calls that pulled men back to their companies. Officers shouted for saddles to go on at once and for animals to be brought in from the grass. Soldiers scrambled to their gear, some barefoot, some with boots half on, trying to gather cartridge belts, carbines, and blankets in fists that shook with sudden adrenaline. Horses, still with sweat dried from the early march, tossed their heads and pulled against halter ropes as men jammed bits back into their mouths and dragged saddles up onto their backs. Mules protested with harsh brays as packers tightened cinches. The brief ease of the halt dissolved in a rush of shouted names, clattering equipment, and the sharp calls of officers trying to impose order. Crook reacted within those first minutes by trying to seize the near high ground before the enemy could grab it entirely. He ordered portions of the 2nd and 3rd Cavalry toward the bluffs on the north side of the basin, with clear instructions to push up quickly and hold. Mounted infantry from the 4th and 9th Regiments were directed to form near the center, ready to move wherever the pressure grew greatest. Crow and Shoshoni scouts who had fallen back from the first ridges were told to swing toward the flanks and continue to harass the advancing warriors. Civilians who carried rifles were waved toward any gap in the forming lines. On the bluffs north of the basin, the fight that had begun as a skirmish between scouts hardened as more men joined on both sides. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders came forward in waves, some closing in small clusters that tried to break the thinner Allied screen, others forming longer ragged lines that fired from horseback at rising cavalry. The Crow and Shoshoni, now backed by growing numbers of blue-coated troopers, kept up a steady fire, using both repeating rifles and Springfields. Some allies called out in English, pointing to concentrations of enemy riders and warning soldiers where to aim. From the perspective of the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, the delay on those ridges was costly but unavoidable. Their plan to strike Crook's resting column before it properly formed had met a hard edge in the shape of the Allied scouts and the 1st Cavalry companies to reach the high ground. Many still pushed forward, driving their horses into the shallow draws and up the slope, trying to gain positions from which they could look down into the basin. Others swung wide to search for breaks in the emerging defensive arc. Every minute that passed allowed more of Crook's command to throw saddles on horses, pull units together, and push men toward the perimeter. Individual acts of courage and loss marked these early exchanges. Crow and Shoshoni men fell where they fought, some dropping on the rocks beside their rifles, others tumbling backward when horses went down under them. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders carried wounded comrades away from the front, leading loose ponies now emptied by bullets. In the basin, a few soldiers who had been slow to react were hit while trying to reach their companies, caught in the open by long-range fire from the heights. Surgeons and hospital attendants began their work even before clear lines had fully formed, dragging the injured behind such cover as they could find, and tying bandages quickly over bleeding wounds. Within less than an hour from the first distant shots, the shape of the field near the headwaters of the Rosebud had changed completely. Crook's command no longer rested loosely in a bowl of low ground. Instead, companies of cavalry and mounted infantry stood in irregular lines along the slopes and lesser ridges that ringed the basin, facing outward. Crow and Shoshoni allies held key points on the higher bluffs, still trading fire at close range with larger groups of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho who pressed them hard. Smoke from many rifles hung in streaks along the heights and drifted down into the valley. The attempt to catch Crook entirely unprepared had been blunted, yet the danger was far from over. Both sides could now see the scale of the opposition. Soldiers looking up from the lower slopes counted long strings of mounted warriors moving along the ridges, their numbers stretching far beyond the first contact points. Warriors peering down saw a basin filled with blue coats, horses, mules, and wagons, all surrounded by a growing ring of armed men. The day had moved from surprise to open battle. The next hours would decide whether the field near the South Fork of the Rosebud became the place where the Wyoming column broke the Northern resistance, or where the combined Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho force stopped one arm of the federal campaign outright. By mid-morning, the basin on the South Fork of the Rosebud no longer looked like a resting place. Smoke hung in streaks along the ridges. Men and horses lay where they had fallen on the slopes. The sharp report of Springfields and the faster chattering of repeating rifles rolled back and forth over the broken ground. Crook had his line roughly set, but every ridge and ravine around the basin was still being fought over in short, violent bursts that shifted by the minute. On the north side, the first shock between the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, Northern Arapaho, and Crook's allied Crow and Shoshoni had hardened into a contested front. The high bluffs that had seemed distant when the column halted now formed a jagged wall. On the forward faces of those hills, small knots of Crow and Shoshoni lay prone behind rocks, working the levers of their repeaters as they answered the pressure from the larger body of warriors pushing in. Behind them, blue-coated troopers from the 2nd Cavalry and 3rd Cavalry scraped out firing positions in the thin soil and tried to extend the line enough to keep the enemy from slipping around either shoulder. Crook watched from slightly to the rear on a low rise, field glasses pressed to his eyes. He saw the pressure on his right and center and knew that if the ridges were lost in the first hour, the whole command could be forced back in confusion toward the creek and the wagon line. He ordered Captain Anson Mills with several companies of the 3rd Cavalry to drive an attack into the enemy concentrations on the high ground to the north and northeast. Captain Henry Noyes received similar instructions for another group. Both officers were told to combine mounted and dismounted action, using their horses for speed and their carbines for close, deliberate fire once they reached the ridgelines. Mills moved first. His companies formed in column behind the line, then swung out at a trot toward a saddle in the bluffs where Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders were clustered in partial cover. Crow and Shoshoni scouts joined them, some riding slightly ahead to point out cuts in the slope and small draws that could shield an approach. Dust rose from under the hooves as they gained speed. Bullets from the heights sent little spurts of dirt up around the charging horses. One animal shrieked and went down in the line, throwing its rider forward into the dust, but the rest pushed on. At the last stretch before the crest, Mills ordered his men to dismount. Troopers swung out of their saddles, handed reins to every 4th man, and climbed the final yards on foot. Carbines came up, and the line broke into a ragged skirmish front that began to fire uphill in quick-paced volleys. The single-shot Springfields did not match the rate of the repeaters above, but their heavier rounds hit hard and accurate when the men took time to aim. Warriors on the crest who had been firing from horseback now faced a steady slope of muzzle flashes driving toward them. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne fighters answered with their own aggression. Some remained in cover and worked the levers of Henry and Winchester carbines, sending rapid strings of bullets down into the advancing troopers. Others mounted and rode down in short, sharp charges that carried them close to the climbing blue line. In those rushes, they fired pistols and rifles from horseback, then wheeled away before they could be fully enveloped. Horses slipped on loose stones. Men went down in the middle ground that neither side fully held. Groans and shouted commands mixed with the louder cracking of shots and the dull thud of rounds hitting flesh and dirt. On one rise, not far from Mills's front, a Northern Cheyenne Society group tried to break the press with a direct charge. They painted their faces and horses in solid blocks and stripes that had specific meanings within their own traditions, and rode together with no gap between them. As they came, Crow scouts on the ridge shouted warnings to the troopers, naming the direction and pointing with their rifles. Mills's men dropped to one knee and fired as quickly as they could, working the breech blocks with practiced hands. Horses at the front of the Cheyenne group collapsed under that fire, their riders tumbling into the grass. Others swerved around the fallen, firing from the saddle before turning back upslope to reform. Farther along the line, Captain Noyes and his companies fought up another spur. The ground there broke into short ledges, each offering both cover and obstacle. Men climbed in bursts, dropping behind each lip of earth to fire, then pushing up again when enemy shots began to walk too close. A few Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders tried to slip around the edge of that advance, aiming for the open flank beyond. But Shoshoni scouts met them in the shallow draws with close, accurate fire from their own repeaters. For a time, the entire front became a scattered pattern of small, hard-fought contests over every knob that offered a view down into the basin. In the center of the field, the terrain narrowed into a long ridge running roughly east to west. Troopers from several companies and groups of Crow allies clung to that spine while Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders worked along both sides of it, seeking chances to strike at points where the line thinned. Here, the contrast in equipment showed clearly. Soldiers fired in a measured rhythm, single heavy shots from Springfields followed by the short pause needed to extract spent cartridges and chamber new rounds. Warriors on good horses could sometimes fire 3 or 4 shots from repeating rifles as they crossed a given stretch of slope, their weapons cycling quickly as they rode. At close range, that volume of fire could push the soldiers back a few yards, but when the troopers managed to catch riders in the open at slightly greater distance, the Springfield rounds struck with enough force that men went out of the saddle suddenly and did not rise again. The fight on Mills's front carried the kind of moment that the Northern Cheyenne would remember for generations. During one of his pushes along a northern ridge, Mills's company advanced across a stretch of ground where the cover thinned. They fired into groups of warriors who had come forward to contest the crest. A Cheyenne fighter named Comes in Sight rode among those men. In the exchange, his horse was hit under him and fell. He left the saddle in the same motion, landing hard and scrambling to his feet on open ground that offered almost no protection. The line of troopers on the slope below saw a man on foot in range. Carbines lifted toward him as he ran. Comes in Sight tried to sprint back toward the nearest fold in the land, but the distance was long under the weight of his weapon and gear. Bullets threw dust at his feet and tore small puffs from his clothing. Behind him, Mills's men fired deliberately, intent on dropping a prominent opponent before he could escape. To the Cheyenne watching from the ridge, it was clear that one more man was seconds away from being shot down in the open, another body to add to the day's loss. At that point, his sister, Buffalo Calf Road Woman, acted. She had ridden with the Cheyenne force from Ash Creek and now sat on a strong pony behind the front line. Seeing her brother on foot under concentrated fire, she drove her horse hard down the slope toward him. The animal ran straight across the field where bullets were already falling. Dust kicked up around its legs. Pieces of torn grass flew. Soldiers in Mill's line saw the rider coming and shifted their aim, some tracking the new target, others holding on the man still running. Buffalo Calf Road Woman reached her brother before the soldiers could adjust completely. She brought the pony alongside him without slowing more than a stride. Comes in Sight grabbed hold and hauled himself up behind her, an awkward, heavy movement on ground that offered no pause. One more volley came from the soldiers below, but horse and riders were already angling back toward the Cheyenne side of the ridge. Bullets passed close enough that both heard and felt them, yet neither fell. Within moments, they had reached the partial shelter of the higher ground, where other Cheyenne fighters closed around them and added their fire to the exchange. That rescue did more than save one life. Men who saw it from the Cheyenne side shouted and struck their weapons against their saddles in recognition. The sight of a woman riding into the worst of the fire to pull her brother out underlined for every warrior on that slope that their families had committed themselves fully to this fight. A wave of renewed energy ran through the Cheyenne ranks. They pushed harder against Mills's line, sending more riders down the slopes in close charges and firing faster from positions that had begun to thin earlier in the morning. Crow scouts and blue-coated troopers, who witnessed the same scene from lower on the hill, registered it as a sign of how far the enemy was willing to go. They had already seen that the Lakota and Cheyenne would press home attacks in ground that offered little safety. Watching Buffalo Calf Road Woman ride through the overlapping volleys to snatch her brother away drove the point even deeper. These were not raiders seeking a quick strike. They stood as a force ready to pay heavily to keep the field and to keep Crook away from their families and lodges. The time around midday saw the battle spread laterally. While Mills and Noyes fought along the northern ridges and center, Other companies and their allied scouts worked to hold the eastern and western approaches to the basin. In some places, the fighting closed to short ranges where men could see the whites of eyes on the other side. Warriors rode in close enough to touch rifle barrels with their own weapons before breaking away. In one draw, a handful of troopers dismounted to hold a small knoll and found themselves fired on from both sides as Lakota riders threaded the folds of the land. They lay flat behind a rough breastwork of stones and saddles, loading and firing as fast as they could while their horses stamped and pulled at the reins tied behind them. Casualties on both sides mounted steadily. A Crow scout dropped to his knees on a ridge after a bullet punched through his chest, then fell forward without a sound. Shoshoni fighters carried a wounded comrade back by lifting him over a saddle and walking his horse down the far slope. In the basin, surgeons established improvised aid points behind the line. Wounded soldiers came in supported by friends or on litters made from blankets and poles. Some were laid out on the bare ground while doctors cut cloth from around bullet wounds, probed carefully for slugs, and tried to stop bleeding with cloth and compresses. The cries that came from those points provided a constant background under the sharper rattling of the ongoing fight. The environmental strain added its own layer of brutality. The sun climbed higher, heating the thin air above the basin. Men in wool uniforms sweated under dust and smoke, their tongues stuck to the roofs of their mouths, and lips cracked as they shouted orders or war cries. Horses lathered and foamed, flanks heaving as they stood under riders who had already pushed them hard since dawn. Each sudden sprint over a ridge took more out of them. When animals dropped, they often did so all at once, legs folding and bodies hitting the dirt with enough force to throw riders clear. As the hours passed, clear lines of advance and retreat became harder to trace. Instead of one side driving the other in a straight push, the battle fractured into many local surges. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors would rush a spur, wrest a patch of high ground from troopers and allied scouts, hold it for a time under heavy fire, then fall back when a coordinated countercharge from cavalry and Crow riders pressed them too hard. Minutes later, another group would strike at a different section of the same ridge, exploiting any momentary slack in attention or ammunition. Mills's companies managed to seize and hold several key positions on their front, thanks in part to the steadiness of their dismounted fire and in part to the constant flank support from Crow and Shoshoni. Noyes's section likewise clung to its gains, though men there fought much of the time with little view beyond the next rise. Crook kept moving small reserves to buttress any point that seemed ready to give way, but he resisted calls from some officers to launch a full-mounted sweep. He could see that the enemy fighters were too numerous and too fluid along the ridges for a single grand charge to crush them in one motion. On the Lakota and Cheyenne side, leaders rode continually along their own lengthening lines, urging men into each new push and pulling them back when fire became unsustainable. Crazy Horse directed movements that sent groups sliding from one side of the field to the other, always seeking a weak spot in the blue ring. Two Moon and others coordinated Cheyenne actions with those of the Lakota so that charges would not waste themselves in isolation. The rescue of Comes in Sight had given them a powerful rallying image. They used that memory, spoken in shouted phrases between exchanges of fire, to keep men in the saddle through repeated attempts to turn Crook's position. Midday light showed a field deeply marked by the hours of combat. The slopes around the basin were chewed up by hooves and feet. Spent cartridges lay thick in some firing positions. Here and there, grass still burned where muzzle flashes had ignited dry patches earlier in the day, thin lines of flame creeping through the stubble until they reached bare dirt or were stamped out by desperate boots. The creek itself ran with a muddied edge where men had fallen into it, and where wounded soldiers and warriors alike had been dragged to its banks for water. Yet despite the ferocity of the charges and countercharges that had already consumed much of the morning and noon hours, neither side held a clean victory on any part of the front. Crook's command still controlled the basin and a set of linked positions along the surrounding ridges. The Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho still held the outer high ground in many places and had not broken off. The initiative now began to shift toward a new focus on Crook's left, where Lieutenant Colonel William Royal with a strong block of cavalry had pushed farther than the rest, and found himself facing a growing weight of enemy riders along a longer ridge to the northeast. As the sun moved past its highest point, the fight that had seen Buffalo Calf Road Woman ride into the fire settled into a grinding struggle, and the question turned to whether Royal's wing could be kept from being cut off and overwhelmed. By late morning, the pressure on Crook's left had turned from a threat into a serious danger. The basin on the south fork of the Rosebud sat under a haze of powder smoke. Noise came from every direction, but one line of sound stood out, a constant grind of firing and war cries from the long ridge to the northwest, where Lieutenant Colonel William Royal's cavalry had pushed farther than any other part of the command. Men near Crook's hilltop headquarters could see only flashes and dust over there, yet every report that reached them said the same thing. Royal stood exposed, and the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne were shifting weight toward him. Royal had ridden hard earlier in the day when the first attacks hit the basin. With 6 cavalry companies under him, he had taken the most aggressive route, driving along the high ground that ran away from the main position toward the broad valley cut by Colmar Creek. His move had started as an effort to clear the ridges that overlooked Crook's resting place. As the enemy fell back along those crests, he kept going, wanting to push them far enough that they could not circle behind and strike the column's rear. Each short success carried his line farther from Crook, until he held a position roughly 1 mile away, separated by a tangle of broken country and the cut of the creek itself. For a short time, Royal's push felt like progress. His men had taken several knobs on the ridge, driving warriors off with close volleys and short charges. Horses blew hard but stayed on their feet. Troopers fired from shallow stone shelters they scraped together and watched Lakota and Northern Cheyenne groups fall back in small bunches. That appearance of control did not last. Once Crazy Horse and other leaders saw how far Royal's troopers had moved from the basin, they began drawing more fighters toward that wing, shifting focus away from the core of Crook's position and onto the isolated block of cavalry. The change showed itself first in the numbers along the skyline. Men on Royal's ridge saw growing strings of mounted warriors sliding along the higher ground beyond them, then dropping into folds that led directly toward their own positions. Fire thickened from both flanks. Shots came from their front and from angles that had been quiet earlier in the morning. Warriors who had been content to trade long-range fire now rode closer, using dips and swells in the land to close the distance before rising to shoot. The ridge that had looked like solid security a short time earlier began to feel like a narrow shelf with steep drops on more than one side. Crook recognized the risk when reports reached him on Crook's Hill. From that central vantage, he watched Mills and Noyes holding on the northern front, infantry and packers reinforcing his own height, and dust plumes swelling near Royal's position. At the same time, he convinced himself that the stubbornness of the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne meant a village stood somewhere ahead along the Rosebud, close enough that the warriors fought to shield their families. On that assumption, he ordered Captains Mills and Noyes to leave the ridge where they had just gained ground and swing eastward along the creek, scouting for the village that he believed lay in that direction. Van Vliet's battalion came back from the south side of the stream to strengthen the main hill. That decision left Royal more alone. While Mills and Noyes turned away along the river with their cavalry, Royal still faced a growing storm. He received Crook's instruction to fall back toward Crook's Hill, and sent one company back as ordered. but he argued later that the rest of his command was too heavily engaged to pull away without being ridden down. On the ground that morning, the men with him saw no easy break in the pressure. Every attempt to shift backward drew immediate rushes from Lakota and Cheyenne riders who tried to close the distance and hit them while they moved. Royal first tried to bring his whole wing back across Colmar Creek. The stream lay down a steep slope from his ridge, its banks cut in places by short, eroded faces. He knew that if he could cross with his companies and climb the far side toward Crook's Hill, the ground would give him a more solid link to the rest of the command. He ordered a withdrawal toward the creek in stages, with sections of his line covering each other as they eased back. At once the fire stepped up. Warriors on the higher knobs fired into the withdrawing files. Others rode along the sides of the ridge, aiming to cut into the troopers as they tried to reach the crossing. When the first troops neared the brink of the creek valley, they found that any attempt to drop down and climb the opposite side would mean going through a funnel under fire from above and from two flanks. Horses bunched at the slope edge, balking at the sudden drop. Men saw bullets kick dust from the trail ahead and slam into animals that had not yet taken the first step down. A crossing attempted under those conditions would have turned the withdrawal into a rout. Royal pulled them back onto the ridgetop, trading the chance of a direct link to Crook for the immediate need to keep the command from breaking apart in the defile. He shifted instead into a slow retreat along the length of the ridge, easing southeast, step by step, always trying to keep some elevation between his men and the enemy. The line moved in short bounds. Sections dropped a few yards back, took new cover behind rocks or low rises, and opened fire while their neighbors did the same. Warriors followed closely, pressing each bend in the ridge. Some slid down into the valley of Colmar Creek and used its course as a covered way to swing farther around Royal's flank. Others remained on the higher ground and poured fire into the troopers whenever they saw an exposed file. At one point, a large mass of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders broke away from the general pressure on Crook's main hill, and drove boldly down the length of the Colmar Valley directly toward Royal's position. The movement carried a sense of full commitment. Dust rose in a heavy plume behind them. War cries carried over the rattle of rifles. Their aim was clear. If they could get between Royal and Crook, they could force the isolated cavalry into a pocket with steep drops on one side and hostile riders on three others. Royal held what ground he could, but the strain showed. His companies had already been in action for hours. Horses were blown and slick with sweat. Men's mouths were dry from powder smoke and shouting. Ammunition belts that had felt full at dawn now rode lighter on hips and shoulders. Every shot spent was counted against what remained. In some troops, the non-commissioned officers walked behind the line, making sure men did not fire without a target, saving rounds for the charges they believed were coming. Captain Guy Henry played a central part in holding that hard-pressed wing. He rode at the front of his troopers along one stretch of the ridge, steadying his companies by example and voice. In the middle of the continuing exchanges, a bullet struck him in the face, smashing through his cheek and jaw. The wound bled heavily. Bone and teeth shattered. For a moment, the men around him thought he would fall. Instead, he stayed in the saddle, blood running onto his coat, and kept calling orders as best he could through the ruined mouth. The sight of their officer remaining in line under that kind of damage kept many troopers from breaking when the fire on Royal's front and sides felt crushing. Even with that resolve, panic began to ripple in places when the charge from the Colmar Valley neared its crest. Some soldiers glanced back toward the basin, measuring the distance they would have to cover if the ridge collapsed. Others tightened grips on reins, ready to run. The pressure broke only when Crow and Shoshoni allies arrived once again at the point of greatest danger. Seeing Royal's companies bowed under the fresh attack, Allied scouts who had been operating nearer Crook's Hill spurred their horses forward and drove directly at the mass of Lakota and Cheyenne climbing from the valley. The countercharge collided with the oncoming wave in a rush of close-quarters fighting. Crow and Shoshoni riders fired from very short ranges, then plunged in with carbines, pistols, and clubs. Their sudden arrival forced the Lakota and Cheyenne riders to split and wheel away, to avoid being caught in the open under fire from both flanks. The ridge echoed with the sound of hoofbeats and shouted insults in several languages. Some men fell on both sides in that swirl. The important result was that Royal's flank did not fold. The Allied riders and their quick attack bought the time his companies needed to pull a little farther back along the crest. Crook added support in a more deliberate form. He sent 2 companies of infantry to occupy a separate hill that looked down on the zone where Royal's men were retreating. Those foot soldiers moved with slow determination, climbing to their chosen position and then forming a solid firing line. Their full-length rifles carried farther than the carbines used by the cavalry. Once in place, they began to send steady, aimed fire into groups of warriors who tried to move too close to Royal's route of withdrawal. Lakota and Cheyenne riders who had been willing to press Royal's troopers at short distances hesitated under that longer reach. They swung wider, staying in hollows and behind rises when they could, wary of presenting themselves as clear targets to the infantry line. That combination of close countercharge from the Crow and Shoshoni and the chilling influence of the infantry fire kept Royal's command from being cut to pieces in those hours around midday. Even so, his wing paid a heavy share of the day's cost. Many of the dead and badly wounded lay along the ridge and near its approaches, men who had gone down holding a line far from the comparative shelter of Crook's Hill. Troopers carried some of the injured back draped over saddles or on improvised stretchers of blankets and poles, slipping and sliding down short pitches of ground while bullets still snapped overhead. Others had to be left until the pressure eased. Near midday, Royal managed to pull his companies into a new defensive position farther southeast along the ridge, closer to the basin yet still under fire on more than one side. From that location, he could look back and see the main body clustered around Crook's Hill and the wagons near the creek. And he could also see the bands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho riders who still lined the higher ring of ground beyond him. The field had widened into a front nearly 3 miles across. Fire and movement rippled along that space in overlapping waves. From his headquarters, Crook saw that Royal was still in danger of being finally cut off if the enemy renewed a concentrated push in that quarter. Mills and his troopers had gone down the Rosebud in search of the village Crook believed stood near the creek. They now rode 2 or 3 miles away, following the bends of the stream. Crook sent fresh orders to Mills to turn back, swing west, and hit the rear of the warriors crowding Royal. The message carried a simple fact. If Royal's wing collapsed, the whole command might need to fight its way out of the basin under pursuit. Mills turned his companies as ordered and drove them back at speed. Horses that had already covered many miles that day were pushed to fresh effort. Dust rose in heavy sheets from their hooves as they raced along the valley and then climbed toward the flank of the main fight. Men in his ranks knew that they were heading toward a field already deep in spent cartridges and bodies. They tightened straps and checked carbines in silence, saving breath for the climb ahead. By early afternoon, Royal started another staged withdrawal, this time angling into a ravine cut by Colmar Creek that led back toward Crook's central position. He understood that the only safety for his beaten, tired companies lay in reaching the shelter of the main concentration. Orders went down the line for men to mount and prepare for a hard dash. On command, troopers swung into their saddles and drove their horses forward down into the low ground, knowing they would draw fire from the ridges above. The air filled with dust and noise as they went, hooves clattering on rock, men hunching low over their animals' necks to present less target. The same Allied scouts who had saved the flank earlier now threw themselves in again to reduce the weight of fire on Royal's retreat. Crow and Shoshoni riders surged forward once more, this time aiming directly at the Lakota and Cheyenne groups that were lining the edges of the ravine to shoot into the withdrawing cavalry. Their rush forced the warriors into fresh movement. Instead of sitting in place and pouring rounds into Royal's disordered column, many had to turn to meet the new threat from the Allies. The result did not erase the danger, but it disrupted the neat killing ground that might have been formed over the ravine. From the hill where Crook had stationed the two infantry companies, long-range volleys swept the edges of the draws and slopes where enemy riders tried to line up clear shots on Royal's men. The slower but deliberate fire of those foot soldiers served as a backstop for the entire movement. Troopers in the ravine heard the heavier crack of those rifles behind them and the nearer answering fire from Lakota and Cheyenne carbines above. They knew they were running a gauntlet, yet each burst of infantry rounds marked one more moment when the enemy had to keep back from the very lip of the slope. Royal's column took its worst punishment in that phase. Horses fell and rolled, pinning riders under them. Men were hit in the saddle and slumped forward, still clinging to reins while their mounts ran on. Others slid out of their seats and vanished in the dust cloud kicked up by the rest of the command. The ground at the lower end of the ravine bore deep prints and gouges from that frantic passage. When the survivors reached the rising ground nearer Crook's Hill, they came up in ragged groups rather than neat companies, uniforms torn, faces blackened by powder and dust, yet still carrying weapons that they had not let go even while falling. Mills reached the enemy flank only after most of Royal's men had already made that brutal dash. His companies came over a rise to see Lakota and Cheyenne riders still engaged in scattered firing at the tail of Royal's retreat, and at the Crow and Shoshoni who had shielded it. The appearance of fresh cavalry on that side, flags lifting and carbines ready, changed the balance at once. Warriors who had spent the entire day in movement and fighting judged the field in an instant. They had already prevented Crook's column from reaching the northern village. They had punished Royal heavily and forced the entire command into a tight ring in the basin. Staying in contact against new cavalry now risked losses that would cut too deeply into their own strength. Groups began to peel away from the ridges, first in small clusters, then in longer strings of riders. They did not run in panic. They rode off in good order, using the same knowledge of the land that had brought them into the fight to carry them away from it. Smoke still hung over the slopes, and scattered shots continued as some warriors fired parting rounds and as a few late skirmishes flared where individual men on both sides refused to disengage. Gradually the noise thinned. Where there had been a solid wall of gunfire and war cries only hours earlier, the field shifted to a pattern of irregular pops and fading shouts. Crook sent portions of his cavalry forward in a short pursuit. Mills's and other companies pushed over some of the heights that the enemy had just left. They saw distant riders dropping into ravines and moving toward the broader northern country. Horses under the blue coats had been worked hard since before dawn. Many could not sustain another long run. Within a short time, the officers called their men back. The column had no strength left for a prolonged chase. The enemy force slipped away into the folds of the distant terrain, its main purpose already met. By mid-afternoon, the Battle of the Rosebud had run its course. The fight had lasted roughly 6 hours, from the first heavy contact on the northern bluffs to the last serious exchanges on Royal's retreat route and Mills's brief advance on the flank. The front at its widest had stretched nearly 3 miles from east to west, a tangled web of separate actions rather than one single straight line. Crook's men had fired tens of thousands of rounds from carbines and rifles in that span. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho fighters had answered with strong volumes of fire from repeaters, other guns, and bows, and had ridden home multiple close charges. The basin and surrounding ridges bore the marks of that effort. Dead and wounded men and animals lay where they had fallen. The grass on many slopes was shredded by hooves and torn by bullets. Cartridge cases carpeted some firing positions so thickly that men walking through them heard metal crunch under their boots. Blood stained the ground in pools and streaks along the routes where bodies had been dragged to improvised aid stations. The air still carried the bitter smell of burnt powder and the sour tang of sweat and blood. Crook still held the ground on which he had fought, yet his command stood battered, short of supplies and miles from any secure base. The Lakota and Cheyenne had broken off by their own choice, leaving him with a field that had cost him dearly and had failed to smash the northern fighting strength that had come boldly out to meet him on the Rosebud. By late afternoon, the firing along the ridges above the south fork of the Rosebud faded into scattered single shots, then into a tense silence broken only by groans, shouts, and the restless movement of animals. The basin where Crook's command had rested that morning now held the wreckage of 6 hours of fighting. Men from the cavalry, mounted infantry, and allied Crow and Shoshoni groups stood or knelt behind rocks and in shallow rifle pits, peering toward the distant hills to see whether the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho would return in one more full rush. In every direction they saw riders pulling away in strings, heading north and west across the broken country. The enemy force had chosen to leave the field on its own terms, and Crook now faced the harder task of deciding what to do next with a tired and bleeding column miles from any fort. He began by ordering the line to hold its positions until scouts confirmed that the warriors had truly withdrawn. Crow and Shoshoni riders who knew the folds of the land in detail moved out at a trot along the ridges and through the lower draws. They watched the backs of the retreating bands, careful not to pursue so far that they would be cut off in turn. When they came back, they reported that the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne had not simply shifted to a new attack point. The war party that had ridden from Ash Creek had turned away toward the north, making no sign of an intention to circle back in the next moments. Only then did Crook allow his companies to relax their immediate grip on the high ground. Men descended from the ridges in small groups, helping the wounded down the slopes, gathering scattered weapons and checking on horses and mules that had bolted when the heaviest volleys swept across the field. Officers tried to reassemble units that had been broken by the running fight. Company rolls no longer matched the men standing in loose clusters near Crook's Hill. Some troopers had died on the distant ridges. Others came in leading 2 horses with a wounded comrade tied to one saddle. Surgeons and hospital stewards had been working throughout the battle, but the slowing of the fire let them expand their efforts into the open. They turned the sheltered side of Crook's Hill into a rough aid ground. Blankets and coats were spread on the earth where wounded soldiers, Crow, Shoshoni, and Packers could be laid out in rows. Water carriers moved constantly between the creek and the makeshift hospital, filling buckets that emptied as soon as they arrived. Blood soaked into the soil under bodies and bandages. The doctors cut away shirts, trousers, and leggings, probed for bullets, and used whatever clean cloth remained to bind wounds. There was no morphine for every man, and no shelter from the heat and dust beyond a few pitched canvas flies. Near the creek, details began the work of burial. Army dead were laid out so that officers could confirm identities from company lists. Fellow soldiers stripped valuables and personal effects to send back to families when reports went east. Shallow graves were dug along the edge of the basin at first, then in slightly higher ground where the soil kept a more solid wall. Wooden markers were knocked together from ammunition box planks and tent poles with names or initials scratched in with a knife where someone knew the letters. Allied Crow and Shoshoni dead received burial in ways that fit their own customs. Some wrapped and placed on scaffolds or ledges, others covered in ground selected by their companions. Crook walked those lines, face set, speaking little. The day had cost him a share of officers and men who had ridden north from Fort Fetterman with full confidence in the spring. Reports compiled that evening and in the following days listed 10 soldiers from the regular companies killed and more than 20 wounded. Crow and Shoshoni losses added at least several more dead and a similar number of wounded men. The final numbers for Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho casualties remained unknown to the Army, because their families carried away their own and buried them according to their traditions well beyond the reach of federal tallies. The field itself showed that both sides had paid a high price, even if neither could point to total victory. As the sun dropped toward the western ridges, Crook called together his principal officers and interpreters near his headquarters tent. The wind had swung, pushing powder smoke away from the basin and bringing cooler air down from the Bighorn side. Men sat on saddles, ammunition boxes, and bare earth, each carrying the fatigue of the long day in his shoulders. The main question lay plain in front of them. Should the column push on toward the north, still hoping to find the large village that Crook believed stood somewhere beyond the ridges? Or should it fall back toward Goose Creek to rest, refit, and wait for fresh supplies and reinforcements? Arguments followed a predictable line. Some officers urged Crook to move forward. They said that despite the casualties and exhaustion, the command still held the field and still possessed enough ammunition and horses to continue the campaign. They feared that pulling back would hand the initiative entirely to the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, who could use the time to regroup, shift their families, and prepare new positions closer to the Yellowstone and Little Bighorn valleys. Others pointed in sharp terms to the physical reality around them. The men were worn down from the long march to the Rosebud and from the fight itself. Horses and mules had been pushed through days of hard riding and now stood thin and blown. Rations were running low and the nearest fully stocked depot lay many miles behind them. Crook listened while keeping his own conclusions close. He knew that Sheridan expected his column to press the campaign and to cooperate with the other forces under Terry and Gibbon, which were moving separately along the Yellowstone and its tributaries. He also knew that his responsibility as a field commander included keeping his men alive and in condition to fight beyond one more day. If he drove the column farther north in its present state and met another strong resistance in similar ground, he risked losing not just a battle but the ability to operate at all in that season. The council ended without a vote. The general announced his decision plainly. The command would withdraw toward Goose Creek on the following day to regroup. That night, the camp on the Rosebud felt precarious. Pickets stood out along the ridges in doubled numbers, Crow and Shoshoni scouts sharing the line with regular cavalry outposts. No one on duty assumed that the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne had gone far. Fires in the basin burned low, shielded when possible to avoid offering clear targets. Men ate what rations they could stomach after the strain of the day. Some fell asleep sitting up, carbines across their knees. Others lay flat on the ground with saddles for pillows and blankets pulled over them, waking at every shout or unexpected sound from the slopes. The clear sky showed stars in sharp detail. The noises of distress from the aid ground continued well into the night. At first light on June 18th, Crook put the withdrawal into motion. The wounded went first. On the previous afternoon and evening, men had prepared as many travois and improvised stretchers as they could manage. Poles cut from nearby timber were lashed together and covered with blankets, clothing, and tent canvas. Where horses were still strong enough, those poles were hitched to saddles so that the injured could be dragged carefully along behind. Others rode in wagons that had been pulled into the basin during the battle and had survived without losing teams. Every step of the movement risked jolting wounds that surgeons had only just managed to close. The main body swung out of the basin in columns that looked very different from the neat ranks that had left Fort Fetterman weeks earlier. Guidons still flew, and companies kept their shape, but gaps showed where men had fallen. Horses and mules limped in places, and some pack animals carried no loads other than empty saddles and harness, the supplies they had once borne expended or redistributed. Crow and Shoshoni riders ranged out to either side as they had on the way in, watching the ridges for any sign that the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne intended to press the retreat. Little movement appeared. The enemy had taken their own wounded and dead back toward the Ash Creek village and beyond. The march south toward Goose Creek followed routes already made familiar during the northward advance. The same broken ridges and shallow valleys now looked harsher under the knowledge that the column was moving away from the point of contact instead of toward it. Dust rose under hooves and wheels. Men walked or rode in silence, for long stretches, each turning over his own version of what the fighting on the Rosebud had meant. Some saw the withdrawal as an unavoidable step given the condition of the animals and the supply line. Others felt that the column had been turned back in the field, and that this march away from the north marked a check from which reputation would not easily recover. Along the way, Crook had to balance speed with care. Pushing the command too fast would increase the number of animals and men who broke down entirely. Moving too slowly would risk allowing the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne to regroup ahead of him. In practice, the need to protect the wounded set the pace. Wagons and travois could not move at a gallop. They advanced in a slow, steady rhythm, jolting over stones and through shallow crossings. Troops formed escorts around them, ready to swing out and form lines if any serious threat appeared on the horizon. By June 19th, the column reached the Goose Creek Valley again. The site that had served as a staging ground now became a refuge. The camp stretched along the creek banks in a series of company streets and wagon parks, with tents pitched for hospitals and headquarters. Engineers and infantrymen began digging rifle pits and low earthworks on the higher points overlooking the camp, turning the site into a more permanent defensive position. The place would soon be known as a continuing base, its location near the foot of the Bighorns marking it as a hinge point in the campaign against the Northern Plains villages. Daily life at Goose Creek in the weeks that followed bore little resemblance to the driving advance that had carried the Wyoming column north in May and early June. Instead of continuous marching, men found themselves in a pattern of recovery, foraging, and local scouting. The wounded from Rosebud occupied the main hospital tents and nearby shaded spots where surgeons and stewards did what they could to keep infection from taking more lives. Some men suffered amputations when wounds turned bad despite earlier efforts. Others improved enough to move on crutches between camp streets, bearing scars that would outlast the war. Food quickly became the dominant concern. The supplies that had come forward in the initial move to Goose Creek had never been intended to support a large force in one place for many weeks. With the decision to remain rather than push toward the Yellowstone, the camp began to strain its stores. During the last part of June and into July, Crook sent out strong hunting and foraging parties into the Bighorn foothills and onto the higher slopes. These mixed groups of soldiers, civilians, Crow, and Shoshoni searched for game and any usable wild plants that could supplement the diminishing rations. They brought back buffalo, deer, elk, and smaller animals when they found them. Yet hunting alone could not fully replace the organized ration trains that had supported the earlier march. As flour, coffee, and sugar ran short, men tightened their belts and learned to stretch each issue. Army bread grew coarse and thin. Meat from hunted animals made up a larger share of meals, sometimes boiled with little seasoning. When official stores dipped to their lowest points, Crook ordered some of the weakest animals slaughtered for food. Soldiers who had ridden those horses and mules felt the weight of that decision. They understood the necessity, but eating animals that had carried them over many miles drove home how far the column had moved from any steady base of supply. The men began referring to this period in terms that underlined its hardship, remembering it as a time when hunger and fatigue bit almost as sharply as enemy fire. Communication with other federal columns during this period remained limited by distance and by the pace of couriers. Crook sent dispatch riders east and north to report his situation and to seek information on the movements of Terry and Gibbon. Those messages took days to reach their destinations. Replies took just as long to return. There was no telegraph station at Goose Creek and no quick way to coordinate in real time with commands moving along the Yellowstone and its tributaries. In practical terms, the Wyoming column operated as a separate force, holding the Upper Tongue and Rosebud country at arm's length rather than pushing back into it. On the northern side of the conflict, the outcome of the Rosebud fight shaped different decisions. In the Ash Creek village, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho families received the returning warriors with songs and laments. Women and elders tended to wounded men, binding cuts and bullet wounds with available cloth and medicines. Horses carrying scars from the fight were rubbed down and inspected. War stories began to circulate almost at once, with particular attention paid to points where warriors had broken close to the soldiers and where the combined force had stopped Crook's advance. The rescue of Comes in Sight by Buffalo Calf Road Woman became one of the leading tales, an example of determination that drew repeated retelling across many lodges. Leaders in that village recognized that their success at the Rosebud gave them a rare window. They had met a large, well-armed federal column head-on and had forced it to withdraw from the northern country. They knew that other army forces were moving in the region, yet they also understood that Crook would need time to recover. Instead of scattering, they chose to keep their strength concentrated. Through late June, the great combined village shifted gradually from the Rosebud watershed toward the valley of the Little Bighorn, drawing in additional bands that decided to stay with the free camp rather than go to the agencies. Lodges multiplied along the river bends. Horse herds grew in size and variety. This movement and consolidation took place while Crook's column remained tied to Goose Creek. The two forces no longer moved in lines that could intersect easily. Distance, fatigue, and supply problems on the federal side, and the choice to keep families together in a single immense camp on the native side, combined to create a gap. Through that gap marched another command. In the last days of June, the column under Terry that included Custer's 7th Cavalry moved up the Yellowstone and then into the valleys that fed the Little Bighorn. Crook did not stand in direct contact with any of this when it occurred. His scouts and dispatch riders brought in fragments of information regarding movements along the Yellowstone and reports from far agencies, but no one in the Goose Creek camp knew the exact position of Terry's or Custer's units on each day. The Rosebud fight had removed Crook's command as an immediate threat to the northern village and had left the next collision to others. When news of the disaster on the Little Bighorn reached Crook weeks later, it would arrive in the same camp where his men had spent long, hungry days after the battle that had turned them back. In the narrow sense, Crook's withdrawal to Goose Creek kept his column intact. He saved most of his wounded, preserved the core of his cavalry and infantry for future operations, and maintained a foothold in the northern Wyoming territory rather than retreating all the way to the Platte. In the wider sense, the decision meant that the planned convergence of Crook's, Terry's, and Gibbon's columns never happened before Custer rode up the Rosebud and down toward the Little Bighorn. The missed junction grew directly from the fact that on June 18th, the morning after the Battle of the Rosebud, Crook turned his men south instead of forcing a broken but still dangerous march toward the Yellowstone. In the weeks that followed the fighting on the South Fork of the Rosebud, the camp along Goose Creek settled into a rhythm that felt less like a marching column and more like a garrison that had been thrown down in the middle of a country that did not want it. Tents stretched in long rows along the water. Horses cropped what grass remained near the banks, ribs more visible under their hides. Men drilled in shortened sessions when they had the strength. then drifted back to their fires to eat whatever the cooks could piece together from shrinking stores and fresh meat brought in by hunting parties. The noise of axes cutting poles and logs for shelters and corrals carried steadily through the valley, a reminder that the Wyoming column had paused long enough to leave deep marks on the place. News from outside came in the form of couriers and scouts who rode in at irregular intervals. One hot day in late June, a small knot of riders appeared on the trail from the north, mounts dragging and foam dried on their flanks. They went straight to Crook's headquarters. Word spread across the camp even before any official announcement that something severe had happened upriver. When the information reached the companies in clear terms, it hit like another volley. Custer and more than 200 men from the 7th Cavalry lay dead along a crooked bend of the Little Bighorn. The same broad native force that had stood in front of Crook on the Rosebud had helped crush another federal column 8 days later. The description that trickled into Goose Creek from scouts, friendly tribesmen, and later from officers who traveled through confirmed the scale. A combined Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho village of several thousand people had camped along the Little Bighorn. Custer's regiment had attacked without full knowledge of the numbers at hand. When the fight ended, his immediate command and many of his officers lay scattered on the hills and coulees above the river. The number of dead soldiers from that action exceeded the entire strength of some frontier posts. To men who had just fought their own 6-hour struggle on the Rosebud, the news felt personal. Many recognized that some of the same warriors who had pressed Royal's companies along Colmar Creek and had charged Mills's front now rode with the groups that overran Custer's battalion. Officers at Goose Creek read the reports and understood that the battle they had survived on June 17th had shaped this later disaster. By stopping Crook and halting his advance for weeks, the Northern force had broken the planned convergence of columns. The Wyoming column sat in its encampment while Terry's and Custer's units moved alone into the valley of the Little Bighorn and met the full concentration of native strength. Around the company, firesmen talked in low voices on how different the Northern campaign might have looked if Crook's command had been strong enough to keep going after the Rosebud. No one needed to spell out that the price for that strength would have been more dead men and animals on their own rolls. In the eastern states, the reaction took a different form. When news of the Little Bighorn reached cities and towns along the railroads, it set off a wave of shock. Newspapers published lists of officers killed, sketches of the ground drawn from early descriptions, and fierce editorials that called for complete suppression of what they described as hostile bands. The earlier fight on the Rosebud received less attention in those first weeks, its mixed result overshadowed by the annihilation of Custer's command. In Washington and in department headquarters, however, officers and officials looked at both actions together. They saw that the combined Lakota and Cheyenne force had stood up to 2 separate federal columns in close succession and had not broken. The federal response came in the form of renewed orders and fresh units. More infantry and cavalry regiments were directed west. Existing posts along the rail lines and in the interior received instructions to strip their garrisons down to minimums and send field companies into the campaign country. The plan for the remainder of 1876 shifted toward exhausting the Northern Plains families and closing off any route that would allow them to stay in the open without constant pressure. The army would not rely on a swift convergence against one camp. It would stack up weight over months, striking where it could in summer and then reaching hard for winter villages when the cold pinned people in narrower spaces. At Goose Creek, Crook had to shape his own part of that broader plan with a worn command. Through July, he received some reinforcements, including infantry and cavalry that raised his numbers again, and fresh supplies that lifted the immediate threat of starvation. The Crow and Shoshoni allies who had fought so hard on the Rosebud had mostly returned to their own homelands for a time, carrying stories of the fight and their dead with them. New scouting parties drew on other native allies and on civilian guides. Crook spent long hours in council with his officers and interpreters, laying out a path that would take the reconstituted force back into the field toward the Powder and Little Missouri country. In August, he moved north again. The combined column, now joined at times with Terry's contingents, patrolled the country between the Tongue and the Yellowstone, seeking any large camps that had not yet broken toward distant agencies or Canada. The effort turned into a long grind across burned grass and bare ridges. Cloth and leather wore down. Men patched uniforms with scraps. Boots split at the seams from constant use. Horses became gaunt despite any feed the quartermasters could secure. The country itself had been stripped in many places by earlier movements of people and animals. Where native families had camped, they had taken their stored food and much of the available game with them. In early September, Crook's troops left the Tongue and swung east in a push that men later remembered with a grim label. Supplies again ran short. For several days, rain fell in sheets, soaking clothing and blankets, turning the ground to a slick paste. Grass along the way had already been grazed off in earlier movements. Horses and mules found little to eat beyond roots and sparse clumps in sheltered hollow spots. Day after day, the men marched 25 to 35 miles through that wet, blackened landscape with almost no flour, coffee, or sugar left in the wagons. Animals that collapsed from hunger and exhaustion were shot, butchered, and eaten on the spot. Soldiers boiled strips of horse meat and chewed them in silence. The march ended only when Crook's scouts located a small mini-Conju village at Slim Buttes in early September. Captain Anson Mills, whose companies had fought along the ridges of the Rosebud, led a detachment that surrounded the camp at dawn. The attack that followed was short and violent. Warriors caught in the lodges fought as they could, while women and children tried to flee through the gullies and brush. American Horse, a respected mini-Conju leader, was mortally wounded during the action. When the firing died down, Crook's main column moved up, and the men saw what the village held. There were stacks of dried buffalo meat, robes, and other goods meant to carry those families through the coming winter. Crook ordered the food divided among his starving soldiers. For the first time in many days, the men of the Wyoming column ate until they could not swallow more. Slim Buttes carried other symbolic weight. Among the goods taken from the captured lodges, the soldiers found items that had been in the hands of Custer's regiment on the Little Bighorn. A 7th Cavalry guidon, blood-stained officer gloves, and government-issue weapons lay mixed with the household objects and meat stores. The sight brought the two branches of the summer campaign together in a visual way that no report could fully capture. To the men who handled those items, Slim Buttes felt like an extension of the same line of conflict that had run from the Rosebud to the Little Bighorn and into this scattered mini-Conju camp. In the months that followed, pressure shifted toward the remaining large northern camps that still tried to stay free on the high plains and in the Bighorn foothills. In late November 1876, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie led a combined force of cavalry and native scouts against a major northern Cheyenne winter camp on the Red Fork of the Powder River. The action known as the Dull Knife Fight broke that village, burning lodges and confiscating hundreds of horses and large stores of dried meat and winter clothing. Many Cheyenne families fled into the cold country with little more than what they could carry on their backs. The ability of that group to continue armed. Resistance as a cohesive body ended there. Farther north, in early January 1877, Crook's troops and native allies met Crazy Horse again near Wolf Mountain in the Montana Territory. The fight there took place in deep winter conditions. Snow lay across the ridges and valleys. Men on both sides wore buffalo robes and layers of clothing against the cold. The engagement itself did not produce a clean tactical decision, but it added to the cumulative strain on the Lakota leadership. Each time the Northern warriors chose to stand, they faced columns that were better supplied and more numerous than the isolated forces that had come into their country earlier in the decade. The steady destruction of winter stores and horse herds, along with the loss of family members in each new contact, cut into the core of resistance. By spring 1877, the network of free villages that had stood together on Ash Creek before the Rosebud no longer existed in the same form. Some bands had surrendered at agencies along the Missouri after the fall and winter campaigns, trading weapons and remaining horses for limited rations and the relative security of army posts. Others still tried to hold out in shrinking pockets of country. Crazy Horse, whose leadership had been central in the Rosebud fight and on the Little Bighorn, brought his following into surrender at Fort Robinson in May. Nearly 900 Lakota with him were counted and recorded on the rolls when they gave up their weapons. The move did not bring him peace. Within months, tensions at the agency, miscommunications regarding his intentions, and strained relations with interpreters and officers led to his arrest and to his death by bayonet in early September. Sitting Bull chose a different path. Rather than yield immediately at a federal agency, he led his people north across the border into Canadian territory in 1877. There they endured years of scarcity, dependent on thin rations and sporadic trade while buffalo herds dwindled. Over time, more and more of his followers left the camps there and returned to agencies in the United States, unable to withstand the strained conditions. In July 1881, with his group reduced to fewer than 200 people, Sitting Bull returned to United States soil and surrendered at Fort Buford. Almost 5 years had passed since the summer when his visions and leadership had helped draw together the massive village that fought at the Little Bighorn and supported the warriors who rode out to meet Crook on the Rosebud. The Cheyenne and Lakota memories of the Rosebud followed their people into those new circumstances. Within Cheyenne families, the day took on the name that emphasized Buffalo Calf Road Woman's Ride. The battle where the girl saved her brother entered oral history as a moment when a woman's decision under direct fire captured the determination of the whole camp. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne elders described the fight as proof that they could meet soldiers in a sustained engagement and stop them from reaching villages when numbers and resolve came together in the right ground. Stories emphasized riders hanging from the sides of their horses to fire beneath the animals' necks, charges against positions held by disciplined infantry, and the willingness of young men and women to risk everything to buy space for their families. On the Army side, officers and enlisted men carried different lessons away from the Rosebud. Many never forgot the role of their own native allies. Crow and Shoshoni scouts had warned them, shielded the camp at the start, and then intervened repeatedly at key moments during Royal's withdrawal and along the bluffs. Veterans whose lives had hung on those countercharges spoke with respect of the fighters who had ridden into the center of the Lakota and Cheyenne pushes, while the regular companies were still trying to form coherent lines. Field reports and later histories noted that without those allies, the column might not have escaped destruction in that basin. Another set of questions focused on weapons and tactics. After the fight, officers and ordnance boards examined why so many thousands of Springfield cartridges fired on June 17th had inflicted comparatively modest visible losses on the enemy, and why extraction faults had appeared in some rifles during heavy use. Complaints from the field helped drive adjustments in ammunition design and in instructions on cleaning and maintaining weapons under campaign conditions. Tactical discussions pushed cavalry leaders to think more carefully on how far they could pursue mounted foes over broken ground without losing cohesion, and how best to combine native allies, infantry, and horse soldiers in future actions so that no single arm of the service stood alone on exposed ridges as Royal's battalions had. In the public mind, the Rosebud never carried the same fixed place as the Little Bighorn. The image of Custer's defeat on the greasy grass filled newspapers, dime novels, and later monuments. The earlier battle that had helped make that defeat possible occupied a narrower space in memory. Yet on the ground itself, traces remained. After Crook's withdrawal, Lakota and Cheyenne people returned to the field and built stone cairns at points where key moments had unfolded. Later generations would walk those ridges and see the piled rocks that marked where relatives had fought and fallen. Years after the Great Sioux War ended, veterans on both sides could still describe the feel of that June morning on the Rosebud in detail. Crow elders told younger listeners how the scouts had first seen the dust of the approaching Lakota and Cheyenne, and how close the enemy came to catching Crook's column flat along the creek. Former soldiers spoke of the shock of waking in a rest halt that turned without warning into a 6-hour engagement spread across miles of broken terrain. Northern Cheyenne families repeated the names of those who had ridden closest to the soldiers' lines, and of the woman who had refused to let her brother die alone on the open slope. In strict numbers, the day cost fewer lives than some later winter attacks on snowbound camps. In effect, it changed the course of a campaign that shaped the rest of the decade. Crook's advance stopped. The northern village retained enough strength to move into the Little Bighorn Valley and to meet Custer's regiment there. The federal government responded with a level of force that no Plains community could resist indefinitely. What had been clear to Native leaders long before the Great Sioux War became plain to many soldiers only then. The people they fought on the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn were not finished or scattered remnants. They were communities that could still put more than 1,000 armed riders into motion on short notice, and were willing to do it. The mistake of believing that the natives were beaten met its correction in that basin along the Rosebud when thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho fighters rode boldly into a valley where a federal commander thought he held the initiative and showed instead that they still had the power to decide when and where the hardest blows would fall.